Hello everyone, and welcome to the Fictional Vortex. So we are back with an interesting movie on what if Naruto had the power of chaos, Biju and daimyos and become Seal Master. But before we start, I just want to remind you to please subscribe to my channel and hit the like button if you enjoy my content. Let's start the story. Failing Twilight Prologue. The Order. Sarutobi Hiruzen, the Professor. The Sandaime Hokage, one of the undisputed most powerful men in the world, stared forlornly down at a small bundle in his arms. From within that bundle appeared the small face of a baby who was sleeping peacefully, blissfully unaware of the happenings of the world around him. Sarutobi let out a sigh as he brought the babe closer to him. "Forgive me, Naruto-chan," the elder shinobi murmured softly. Things had not quite gone as planned over the past few days for Sarutobi. After the Yondaime's death and the subsequent defeat of the Kyuubi no Kitsune, he'd hoped that things would settle down in Konohagakure no Sato, the village hidden in the leaves. Alas, it was not to be. The citizens of Konoha were angry and distraught and had begun crying out for blood. Especially after learning the fate of the Kyuubi. Sarutobi had managed to quickly silence them, but the council could not be so easily put down. While they, fortunately, were wise enough to harbor no ill will towards young Uzumaki Naruto, neither did they lean in his favor. Just earlier that day they had forbid Sarutobi from taking an active part in Naruto's life. Being the Hokage, Sarutobi had immediately protested against this ruling. Unfortunately his power was over shinobi, and Naruto was a civilian, not a shinobi. So the order stood. Sarutobi didn't need to turn to know that a shinobi had just entered into the room. Nor did he need to look to know who it was. Have the preparations been made? The reinstated Hokage asked. His voice was weary, as if he'd aged decades in just a few short days. Yes, the Anbu in the room answered shortly. Everything is ready, sir. There was a pause and Sarutobi easily picked up on the shinobi's uneasiness. Speak, he said softly. The Anbu gulped before doing so. Forgive me, Hokage-sama, he began. But, are you sure about this? Are you sure that you shouldn't assign at least a few ninja to watch over the boy? Alas, I wish I could. Unfortunately, the council is correct. I have no influence over civilians except in a time of war. No, I'm afraid that Naruto shall have to face the world on his own. With a second sigh Sarutobi finally turned around to face the Anbu. With a few quick strides he walked over to the man and then gently passed the baby to him. The Anbu accepted his charge somewhat awkwardly, but firmly nonetheless. Good luck, Naruto-chan. Sarutobi murmured quietly as his hands fell away. I hope to see you again someday soon. Without even a whisper of movement the Anbu was gone, leaving a bent old man alone in his office. Dear Kami, I hope I have made the right choice. A.N. This story is the result of me listening to 3 Days Grace in the middle of the night while dealing with a high fever. Na said. My goal for this FIC is to keep this story realistic, while making it original. I hope I succeed, grins. On that note, this story is going to be very different. You see, most OFIX generally end up being about how Naruto would view events if he'd been smarter, raised by someone else, etc. And because they stick to only the canon events, they tend to get pretty boring pretty quick. If I wanted to read about what happens in the canon, then I'd go read the manga. But as this is fanfiction, I want to read something that deviates a bit more from canon. This story, as I just said, will be Sure, the major events will still be there, but I'll be switching things up a lot, including things that are generally taken for granted. Grins, you'll see what I mean. As a last note, these first few chapters will be a build-up of Naruto's situation and what his character will be like. The main plotline for this story will be revealed in Chapter 4 and things will start to pick up from there on. Please review and tell me what you think. S.R. Archive. Chapter 1. The Dark. Title. Failing Twilight Author. Shadow Rebirth Beta Reader. Rukia 23 Rating. T. Warnings. Death, blood and gore, coarse language. Adult themes, spoilers. Chapter WC. 3446 Story WC, 3911. First written. April 24, 2008. Last edited. February 21, 2009. Posted. October 16, 2008. Summary. Naruto H. Ad learnt from a young age that life could get hectic, but all this chaos with Biju, daimyos, and psychotic missing nin was going a bit too far. Now just throw in a 4th grade shinobi war and you've got one pissed off seal master. Oh story. No pairings. Failing Twilight Chapter 1. The Dark. For as long as he could remember he had liked dark places. Ones that were hidden away and hard to get to. Ones that were isolated from civilization. Maybe it was the empty feeling that such places gave off, the feeling of something just waiting to be explored. Or maybe it was the knowledge that he could do whatever he wanted and be whoever he wanted there, and no one would be able to judge him. Or, perhaps, it was because the places reminded him so much of himself, if even only unconsciously. They were abandoned, alone, ignored. And yet they were still standing defiantly. They were hidden away, just waiting for the right person to come along and take notice of what was really there. Whatever the reason may be, he loved dark places. He loved finding abandoned buildings and exploring their passageways. He loved finding out all of their secrets and reveled in the knowledge that he was perhaps he first person to step foot in them in years. He loved just knowing that they were his secrets. Some might say that such a love of old, dark places wasn't normal, but he loved them anyway. After all, no one had ever accused Uzumaki Naruto of being normal. It was because of his love of dark places that when at the age of 5 Naruto discovered a network of old, abandoned buildings he was, needless to say, ecstatic. The buildings were in the rough, run-down part of Konohagakure no Sato, the red light district, some called it. It was there that drug dealers, prostitutes, and gang members frequented. Though at that time Naruto knew little of such things. What the young blonde did know however was that the building had once been part of a system of storage buildings and apartments. Some years back the company that had owned them had gone bankrupt, leaving them empty. Though many people used the main, front buildings for various things, the ones in the back were left untouched. Thus there were many interconnecting rooms, passageways, and cellars at Naruto's fingertips, just waiting to be explored. So explore them he did. Left to his own devices as he was, Naruto had a lot time on his hands as much as he wanted. He spent numerous days in those empty buildings, searching every nook and cranny. No matter how many times he went into that complex there was always something new for him to find. Whoever had designed the buildings had made the halls incredibly twisty, like a maze, so that they seemed to come out in a different place every time. This was very confusing, especially to such a young child. But that oddity only made him love the buildings even more. Naruto's favorite part of the complex was the basement, though he used such a term lightly. It was, in fact, a system of or ground rooms and vaults that were unbelievably difficult to get into, although there were many entrances to it. It actually took Naruto a week to find out that there even was a basement, but as soon as he'd found it he immediately took it upon himself to find every entrance that he could, even though he got lost more times than he could count in the process. It wasn't long before Naruto had practically moved into the basement of the buildings. As an orphan he had a small apartment that was paid for by the government, but he found himself liking the places he'd discovered much more. True, the abandoned buildings were filled with mildew, dust, and rats, and the floorboards groaned with every step he took, but he loved them even so. Naruto loved the mystery that they were filled with and he loved the isolation that they brought. He'd never been very good with people, so he was happier away from them. Away from the stares, away from the whispers, and away from society. If he was going to be alone then he'd be so by choice. In his own little clubhouse. 3 months after he'd first found the abandoned complex Naruto made a discovery. He had been walking through the upper levels when he found himself in a room that he'd never been in before. This one was tucked away, the doorway mostly hidden by an old, empty cabinet. At first as Naruto walked around the room he found nothing of interest, just dust, cobwebs, and broken furniture. The young boy wasn't looking where he was going however, and stubbed his toes on a loose floorboard. Uncoordinated as all children are at that age, he immediately stumbled forward and fell into an old, rotting chest, which upon impact, splintered into several pieces with a resounding crash. For several long moments Naruto stayed perfectly still where he'd fallen, his heart pounding fiercely against his ribcage. Of course there was no one in the nearby area to have heard the crash, but fear gripped him nonetheless. Only when several minutes had gone by without the sound of feet pounding down the hallway outside did Naruto allow himself to relax. Slowly, he extracted himself from what was left of the chest and shook the dust and splinters from his clothing and unruly hair. He was just about to make a quick escape from the room, but it was then that curiosity, his greatest trait as well as his greatest downfall, took a hold of him and held him in place. The chest, Naruto saw, was not quite as empty as he had first believed. Rather, it was filled with a number of scrolls that were so old that they'd turned yellow and were falling apart. In fact, only one of them was still wholly intact, and the red ribbon tied around it crumbled into pieces as the child picked it up. Naruto sat down on the dusty floor and opened the scroll with uncharacteristic gentleness. Once it was spread out before him, he found that the entirety of the paper was filled with old-style kanji that he had to squint at to read. But he could in fact read. Naruto had been reading since he'd taught himself when he was just 3 years old. Amusingly enough, Naruto had done so by looking at comic books. He'd seen the pictures and had then said aloud to himself what the picture was explaining. Then as the characters were speaking, he'd say to himself what he thought it was they were saying. Using that system, and the world around him, Naruto taught himself to read. It wasn't a fast process by any means, but it worked nonetheless. Before long Naruto found himself reading anything that he could get his hands on, from posters, to street signs, to entire books. Some people might call such a feat from such a young child incredible, but no one knew of it. Naruto had no reason to tell anyone, or anyone to tell for that matter. Regardless, as Naruto sat with the scroll before him, he felt what could only be described as extreme excitement. He loved to read but rarely had anything good that he could read. Now he had this old scroll, and it was for him and him alone. Fuin. Naruto read aloud somewhat brokenly, the art of sealing. Naruto paused to frown down at the scroll, not at all understanding what he was reading. He pushed on anyway, even though it would actually be several more years before he could truly comprehend the concepts contained within. For if there was one thing that Naruto loved more than dark places and reading, it was a challenge. Before very long Naruto took to exploring more of the area outside of the complex, and eventually the other residents of the district got used to seeing him. Unlike the regular citizens, they were too wrapped up in just trying to survive to pay much attention to the small blonde, blue-eyed child that wandered around. As long as he didn't bother them, they wouldn't bother him, and that suited Naruto just fine. On one calm evening Naruto found himself peeking into a rather seedy tavern, where thick smoke permeated the air, dimming the lights, while drunken laughter shook the wooden floor. Normally he would have left rather quickly in order to avoid being noticed, but this time he caught sight of a half-eaten loaf of bread sitting on an abandoned table in a corner of the tavern, doubtlessly left there as an unfinished, forgotten meal. Of course, it was at that moment that Naruto's stomach rumbled, announcing its hunger to the world. Naruto, like all other orphans, received a stipend each month for food. This stipend was rather meager though, so Naruto was unable to eat as often as one might think. In fact, he had yet to eat at all that day. Had the loaf of bread been close to the bar that ran along one wall of the tavern, Naruto wouldn't have even bothered with it. As luck would have it, however, it was closer to the wall opposite the bar. There was only one table filled with them close to it, and they were most likely drunk, so he just might be able to reach the bread without being noticed. It was another rumble from his stomach that decided it for Naruto. Carefully, Naruto edged his way along the wall of the bar, making his way toward the corner table with the bread atop it. None of the many people in the hazy bar seemed to take any notice of him, and his confidence grew with every step he took. Before very long, however, Naruto grew closer to the rowdy table of men. To get to the bread he'd have to pass within just a few feet of them. Naruto almost turned back right then and there, but just managed to hold himself in place. He couldn't leave now, not when he'd gotten so far, not when he was so close. Slowing his steps, Naruto continued on his way. He hung his head down as he walked, hoping against all hope that he wouldn't be spotted. As he passed though, he couldn't help but watch the table from the corner of his eye. There were 6 men there, most smoking Garrets or cigars and all drinking alcohol. On the table before them were cards and they seemed to be gambling. "Oh, don't be such a wuss, Nadao," one man was saying to another, "you're already fucking pathetic as it is." "Hey," the other man protested angrily, but the first just bulldozed on. "You can't even play poker properly. Hell," he threw in with a nod towards Naruto, "that kid could probably beat ya." Instantly Naruto froze while staring at the table with wide eyes, fear coursing through his veins. While the other men began laughing raucously, a third man, the one closest to Naruto, let out a snort. "Don't be such a damn drama queen," he said with a chuckle. While the first man made some sort of a rebuttal, this man turned in his seat to face Naruto. The blonde noticed that the man, who appeared to be in his mid-20s, had shaggy black hair and dark eyes. A ragged scar ran down the left side of his face, from his forehead to his chin, and a cigarette hung lazily from his lips. "Do y'all even know how to play poker?" the scarred man asked with a light grin. "And no," Naruto stuttered out. It felt as though his heart was attempting to leap from his chest, so intense was his fear. But for some reason his feet seemed to be glued to the ground. "Bah, that's a crime, dat is," the man continued while waving a hand through the air in an apparently random gesture. "Everyone, even, no, especially, children should know how to play poker." He paused for a moment to glance over the blonde with a critical eye. "What's your name anyway, kid?" Ever so slowly, Naruto was relaxing in response to the man's open and friendly attitude. "I'm Naruto," he replied in a small voice. "HN," the man said thoughtfully, "strange name." Naruto's young face screwed up in anger, but before he could even open his mouth another man at the table let out a bark of a laugh. "Like you want to talk, Tsuki," he sneered. "Ah, fuck off," the scarred man, Tsuki, snapped. He rolled his eye before turning his attention back to Naruto. A mischievous grin on his face once more. "Well, anyway, Naruto-chan, ya gotta learn 'bout poker somehow. Come, air and I'll teach ya da basics." At first Naruto was very hesitant about going anywhere near Tsuki, but curiosity eventually got the better of him and he began to inch towards the man. Tsuki either didn't notice his attitude or just chose to ignore it. Either way, as soon as the blonde got close enough, Tsuki continued on, explaining the rules of the game. Naruto listened closely, paying keen attention to what the older man was saying. The game quickly caught Naruto's attention and before long he was deeply involved in a conversation with Tsuki, shooting out question after question. "But how do you know if you've got a better hand than everyone else?" Naruto asked. All of his earlier apprehension was completely gone, replaced by childish curiosity. "How do you know that you're making the right choice in betting?" "Well, ya never know fair sure, till da end, when da ands are revealed," Tsuki told him with a grin. "But ya can guess whether the others have good or bad ands by watching 'em." He lowered his voice to conspiratorial tones. "Fair example, ya see dat guy across da table. He's most likely gotten a bad and ya can tell 'cause he's grippin' his cards a little harder den he normally does and his mouth muscles keep on twitching every now and then." Naruto squinted hard at the man across the table, but for the life of him he couldn't see the signs that Tsuki was talking about. When he complained about this to him though, Tsuki only laughed. "Keep watching," he said. "Y'all see 'em eventually, with enough practice. What poker is really about is not so much what ands you get, but about figuring out what everyone else, as in keeping them from knowing what you avenue. It's a game 'bout tricking your opponents." "Oi, Tsuki," the first man to have spoken called across the table, "if you're done playing babysitting then get back to the game. Are ya in or out?" While Tsuki returned to playing with only an amused grin thrown in Naruto's direction, the young boy did as he'd been instructed and began to watch the game. As the hours passed he really began to see what Tsuki had been talking about. He noticed the minute glances thrown around, the muscle contractions, and the way voices either raised or lowered. He saw all of this and without really knowing, he began to learn how to read people. In the corner of the bar the half-eaten loaf of bread sat, forgotten. After his first introduction to poker Naruto began to visit the tavern, the Black Wolf Tavern. He'd later learn almost every night. He never played, but contented himself to just watch. Tasuki was always there and he always talked to Naruto. Not just about poker either, but about anything and everything that came to the man's mind. Naruto had also been working on deciphering the old scroll he'd found. It was difficult, and though he still didn't get most of it, his reading had improved enough that he now knew that it was about the kinds of seals that monks and shinobi made. These seals could do just about everything from storing objects in a scroll, to molding chakra, to creating wards, to summoning objects. Frankly, it fascinated Naruto, and even at his young age he caught on to just how useful it could be. Because of his first discovery, Naruto also spent some time re-exploring the complex, searching for any other scrolls that may have been left behind, though he only managed to find a few and none of them contained anything particularly interesting. Naruto was happy nevertheless. On one fine day near the beginning of summer, Naruto trotted down one of the larger roads in the shopping district of Konohagakure. He kept his head lowered and his shoulders hunched as he walked. If only because that was how he was used to walking in the red light district. In that place, meeting someone's eyes was just like asking to get beaten up. As the blonde child walked, however, he noticed a familiar face up ahead. Tasuki, he called out happily, even as he dashed forward towards the man. Tasuki glanced around in surprise as his name was called, but as soon as his eyes fell on Naruto, his face split into a wide grin that caused the scar on his face to twist strangely. "Ah, kid, whatcha ya doin' round here?" Naruto shrugged in reply. He'd actually been visiting his apartment, but he had no reason to tell Tasuki about that, friend or not. "What are you doing?" Naruto asked curiously. Tasuki let out a low chucked just picking up some cash for da game tonight. Naruto's brow furrowed in confusion. "But, how?" "Easy," Tasuki replied while grinning down at the blonde. "Just watch." For almost a minute Tasuki stayed silent as he walked next to Naruto while the boy watched curiously on. Then, just moments after brushing past a man, he raised his hand to show a small money pouch grasped there in his fist. Naruto let out a gasp and twisted around to look back behind him as he walked. The man Tasuki had just stolen from walked on, completely unaware of what had just occurred. "How'd you do that?" Naruto asked while looking up at his companion in awe. "Practice," Tasuki answered with a wink. "If there's one thing dat ya should always remember, kid, it's dat ya should always make da first strike. Da world ain't gonna wait for ya. Survival, Naruto-chan. Survival is ta one thing dat matters most in da world." Tasuki threw his head back then and let out a rough laugh. Naruto responded with a small grin of his own, but didn't reply. Why, as his mind began to mull over the older man's words. "Say," Tasuki said after a minute while eyeing the money, "how'd y'all like ta go and get something ta eat?" "Yeah," Naruto exclaimed happily while jumping up and down. "How about ramen? Ya ever add ramen, Naruto-chan?" Yet another crime," Tasuki said while staggering back and clutching at his chest as if he'd been stabbed by a sword. Naruto giggled at the scarred civilian's antics. "All avenue ta show ya den. I know dis great place. They've got da best ramen in da world there." Quote. Tasuki led Naruto through the streets until the boy was sure that his legs would fall off. Just when he thought that he couldn't go any farther, Tasuki came to a stop in front of a small ramen stand. Ichiraku Ramen was spelled across the top of it. Tasuki led the way inside and sat down at one of the stools there. "Hey, old man," he called out. "You there?" As he called, a somewhat heavy man who looked to be in his early 40s came out from the back of the shop. Yeah, quit your yappin'," he said good-naturedly. It was obvious even to Naruto that the two men knew each other. "What?" he began, only to halt as he caught sight of Naruto peering over the counter. "Why, who's this?" "Dis is Naruto-chan," Tasuki replied with a grin. "He's never had ramen before, so I thought I'd bring. I am ta da best ramen joint in town." "A new customer. Well, in that case you get one bowl of miso ramen each." "On the house." Tasuki let out a howl. "Hell yeah," he exclaimed. "Now that's what I'm talking about." The older man Tuki, as Naruto would learn, chuckled as he busied himself with making the ramen. Just a few short minutes later 2 steaming bowls of ramen were placed on the counter. It was Naruto's first gift, and it was on that day that he fell in love with ramen. There are a couple of things I want to make clear about this story. 1. Though he's intelligent, this will not be Super Naruto story. He'll be skilled, certainly, but not unrealistically so. 2. Naruto will not have a bloodline. The point of Naruto's strength in the manga anime is that he gets his power solely from himself, without having anything to rely on except for the Kyuubi, of course. Naruto's strength in this story will mostly come from his will and his creativity, among other things. And 3. Naruto is not now, nor ever will be, abused by the villagers. Those plots are fucking unrealistic. The third creates a law, punishable by death, to stop people from saying that Naruto's a Jinchuriki, but lets people form mobs and beat him. Yeah, right, you. Also notice that I won't be showing too much hatred from the villagers toward Naruto in this story. The reason is because Naruto spends most of his time in the red light district, where people don't give a damn who he is. So most of the villagers don't recognize him on sight. If they heard his name or were close enough to see his whisker marks, then they'd know who he is and would probably be cold to him. But other than that, he's just another blonde-haired kid to them. Oh, and to some of you, the whole teaching himself to read at the age of 3 thing might seem unrealistic, but I actually took the idea from a Native American author who did just that at the same age and in the same way described. So it is in fact possible. And since Naruto wouldn't have much else to do, I personally I'd easily see him becoming an avid reader. Arc Chapter 2, The Building. Title: Failing Twilight. Author: Shadow Rebirth. Beta Read R. Rukia 23. Rating: T. Warnings: Death, blood and gore, coarse language, adult themes. Spoilers. Chapter WC 4053. Story WC 7964. First written May 17, 2008. Last edited February 21, 2009. Posted October 21, 2008. Summary: Naruto had learnt from a young age that life could get hectic. But all this chaos with Biju, daimyos, and psychotic missing nin was going a bit too far. Now just throw in a 4th grade shinobi war and you've got one pissed off seal master. Oh, story. No pairings. Failing Twilight. Chapter 2, The Building. Naruto was 6 when he got into his first fight. He'd been taking a shortcut through a back alley when he was jumped by a group of teenagers intent on stealing his money. When they found out that he had absolutely no cash on him, well, needless to say that they weren't very happy. Damn brat, one of the teens snarled. You think that you can just come into our territory like you own the place? Naruto was utterly terrified, but he held his ground stubbornly. I was just passing through. No sooner had he spoken than stars exploded in his vision and he found himself lying on the ground. Tears forming in the corners of his eyes from the pain, and he grasped at where he'd been hit in the face while pushing himself into a sitting position. Ah, did that hurt? Another of the teens mocked, as the little baby going to cry for his mommy. Anger began to build within Naruto as he stared up at the leering faces of the boys. Fuck you, he spat out. The teens just continued to laugh menacingly. Ah, look, the second guy continued, the baby knows a big boy word. Naughty, we should teach him to respect his superiors, At that moment something within Naruto snapped. Snarling in rage, he leapt at the teen. The boy let out a surprised yelp and the others quickly began attacking Naruto as well. The next few minutes were a blur to the blonde. He fought against the group of teenagers like a wild animal, biting, scratching, and kicking with all his might. Small as he was, however, he was capable of taking down even just one teenager, let alone a whole group of them. And so when the teens finally walked away from the alleyway, they left a bruised, bloodied, and broken Naruto behind. As Naruto lay in the dirt, he could barely even whimper. Actually, he could barely even breathe due to a couple of broken ribs, but he didn't really notice that because of the excruciating pain coming from his other limbs. Ever so slowly Naruto dragged himself into an empty cardboard box that was lying on its side. Once there, his arms gave out beneath him and he knew that he wouldn't be able to go any farther. The young child curled into a fetal position and cried silently as blissful unconsciousness took him. The next morning Naruto's first thought was to question why he was lying inside a cardboard box. Then, as his memories of the night before came rushing back to him, he wondered why he wasn't hurting all over. In fact, he felt absolutely fine, if a bit exhausted. Startled by this revelation, Naruto quickly sat up and inspected himself for the wounds he'd received the night before, but found nothing. No lacerations, no bruises, no broken bones. Nothing. Just pure, unblemished skin. Naruto might have thought that he'd dreamt the entire encounter had his clothes and the box beneath him not been stained crimson with his blood. Naruto stumbled to his feet as his mind whirled with confusion. Why wasn't he injured? Even he knew that people didn't normally heal that quickly. So how was it that he was all right? How? While his mind was elsewhere, Naruto's feet took him to the Black Wolf Tavern. As it was early in the morning, only a few people were there, but it was open nonetheless. Naruto pulled himself up onto one of the bar stools and rested his forehead on the cool wood of the bar's counter. You're here early. Naruto-chan, commented the bartender, can I get you anything? Just water, Naruto replied hoarsely. A minute later something was set before him with a clunk. When he looked up, Naruto found, to his surprise, that the bartender had given him both water and a small bowl of soup. He stared inquiringly at the older man. It's on the house, the bartender told him, you look like you need it. Naruto gave the man a small smile that quickly disappeared. Thank you, Haru-san, he said before quickly digging into the food. For some reason he felt hungrier than he normally did. About halfway through the meal Naruto began slowing down. Despite his raging hunger he spent several minutes pushing his food around with his spoon, thinking. Hey, Haru-san, the young blonde inquired while still in thought. Has something ever happened to you, something that you couldn't explain? The bartender, Haru, frowned at Naruto. Well, sure, unexplainable things happen to everyone at least once in their lifetime, he said. Why? Has something happened? Naruto hesitated before opening his mouth once more. Well, you see, he began, I got into this fight last night. You did what? A voice suddenly interrupted. Naruto blinked in surprise as he watched Tasuki slide onto a bar stool next to him. The scarred man stared at Naruto with raised eyebrows and for reasons unknown to the young boy he felt his face begin to heat up. I didn't mean to, he defended hotly, a group of teenagers jumped me. It's not a bad thing, Tasuki replied while waving a hand dismissively. Gonna avenue ta fight in y'all life, so I suppose it's best ta learn while you're young. But against a group o' boys 10 years older than ya, why da hell didn't ya run away? Naruto looked indignant. Run away like a coward, he exclaimed, I'd never do that. Tasuki rolled his eyes and suddenly Naruto felt very childish. It ain't about cowardice or honor, the scarred man said gruffly, it's bout survivin'. When it comes down to it, especially in a situation like dat where you're outnumbered and outskilled, ya avenue ta decide what's best fair ya in dat moment, ta fight or flee. Bravery don't mean shit if you're dead. As Tasuki spoke, Naruto had been slowly sinking lower down in his seat. It wasn't the reprimand that he didn't like, but rather that he knew that what Tasuki was saying was true. He hadn't been in the red light district long yet, but even a few weeks, let alone a few months, are more than enough to disillusion anyone about how hard it was to survive. Ya don't exactly look as though ya got da shit beat out of ya though, Tasuki commented. Ah, that's what I was just about to say, Naruto said with a glance at Haru. When I woke up this morning I was completely healed. No bruises or nothin'. Tasuki let out a low whistle. That's some nice constitution y'ave got there, he replied, you're lucky. Naruto's brow furrowed. What's cons? Haru let out a hearty laugh. Constitution. It's a term for how fast you heal and how healthy you are, he told the blonde. It's a good thing, Tasuki added, while playfully ruffling Naruto's hair. The young boy scowled and ducked away, much to the two adults' amusement. Following his first fight, Naruto found himself exercising more, running, doing push-ups, etc. He hated how weak he'd felt when fighting the group of teenagers and wanted to remedy it as quickly as possible. In the following months Naruto purposefully got himself into many other fights in order to gain experience, though they were mainly with kids just a few years older than him. And with thanks to his newfound healing abilities, he'd wake up the next morning looking none the worse for wear. One day, however, Naruto found himself involved in a mystery. He'd been out in downtown Konoha, returning from lunch at Ichiraku, when he noticed something. There was a group of black-clad shinobi entering a building. Now, this in itself wasn't a strange occurrence. Naruto saw shinobi all the time after all. But what was strange was the building itself. It was a rather plain and nondescript structure that stood only a few floors over the ground and seemed to blend in with everything around it. Why would shinobi be going into such a place? All of the official buildings were a mile or two away, closer to the Hokage Tower. Curious as he was, Naruto just couldn't let this go. Hesitantly at first, the blonde child crossed the street to the building. The door handle moved easily beneath his small fingers and he turned it and opened the door. Only to come face to face with someone's knees. Naruto's eyes traveled up and up, seemingly forever, until he saw the mean, angry face of the tall man, a shinobi. Naruto's mind automatically supplied, standing before him with a glare. Naruto let out a terrified squeak and immediately turned around and fled back into the alleyway across the street. Once he was safely hidden behind a trash can, Naruto chanced a peek back at the building. It sat there, innocent and plain as ever, as if mocking him. If Naruto's curiosity hadn't been piqued before, it certainly was now. From that day on, a large amount of Naruto's time was spent watching the building, as he'd taken to calling it. He watched it secretly, of course, or at least as secretly as a 6-year-old could. He noticed over time that there were many shinobi who entered and left the building. They used all sorts of entrances, including windows and the roof. Despite all of this activity, Naruto could find absolutely nothing out the building that hinted at its purpose. He discreetly asked people, store owners, mostly, but everyone seemed to be under the impression that the building was abandoned. Finally, after many weeks of stakeout, Naruto decided to attempt to get into the building again. It seemed that that would be the only way to get any information. He knew that going through the front door was completely out of the question. So instead he thought he'd try the back door. Sneaking through the dark alleyway behind the building was almost laughably easy for the blonde, even though he saw several shinobi in the area. One of the first things that anyone in the red light district learned, after all, was how to sneak around Konohagakure, the hidden leaf village. It was honestly surprising how many back passage ways and alleys there were in Konohagakure. According to Haru, there were even some passages down near the sewers. They had been built for maintenance or something, but were generally used for more nefarious purposes nowadays. Once he'd reached the back door of the building, Naruto quickly slipped inside. Fortunately, this time there was no one there. Naruto had taken only a few steps into the dim room, however, when a shinobi abruptly appeared from down one of the several halls that connected to the room. Upon seeing Naruto, he pulled up to a sudden halt, surprise playing across his face. What the hell? Naruto stared fearfully up at the man a few feet from him. In his early 20s, the man was massively built and was perhaps even taller than the first shinobi the blonde had run into. Numerous ragged scars marred his face, though a Hittite in the form of a bandana covered most of his head. For a moment the two, child and shinobi, simply stared at each other in surprise. After a few seconds the trance was broken and Naruto instantly turned on his heel and ran back out the door that he'd just entered. "Oi!" the shinobi called after him. The blonde paid the man no mind, however, and instead just continued running until he was well away from the building and had hopefully lost any possible pursuers. Despite this incident, Naruto found himself still determined to get into the building. Perhaps more than ever now that he knew that there was something going on inside. He waited for a week after his second attempt to try again, this time through the windows. Unfortunately, try as he might, he couldn't get any of the windows to budge even an inch, and eventually left before he could get caught again. So instead Naruto tried the roof entrances. This time he managed to get in and actually got pretty far before the scarred shinobi found him and chased him out again. Naruto refused to allow his failed attempts to dampen his spirits. Time and time again he tried to get into the building, but time after time he was caught by the scarred shinobi. Naruto would later swear that the man lived in the building, as he seemed to always be there, no matter what time it was. One evening, After yet another failed attempt, Naruto dragged himself into the Black Wolf Tavern. The boy strode through the room with confidence a far throw from the terrified street urchin that he'd been Biju. A year ago and over toward a particular table in the corner of the room where a group of men were playing poker. He slipped into the single empty seat there, right next to Tasuki. "Hey, Naruto-chan," one of the men exclaimed. "We haven't seen you here in a while. Are you finally going to bed instead of just watching the game?" Another of the men joked. Naruto shook his head while grinning impishly. The other men laughed boisterously while turning their attention back to their game. That night Naruto didn't really see the game, even though his eyes were on the table the whole time. His mind was just too preoccupied with his current situation to really pay any attention. "What's up?" Tasuki finally asked. "Ya seem really distracted tonight." "I am," Naruto admitted. "It's just that there's this problem that I have that I can't get around. I've tried everything that I can think of, but nothing seems to work." Tasuki shrugged while taking another swig from the bottle of sake in his hand. "Well," he said thoughtfully, "sometimes ya can't face a problem, ead on. Instead yav got ta take a step back and look at ta big picture. Do dat and y'all often find an obvious solution dat yod avenue missed before." Naruto frowned at Tasuki. Yeah, he got what he was saying, but he'd already looked at the problem from every possible angle. All of the entrances to the building were heavily guarded and there seemed to be no way in without getting caught. They were shinobi after all. Abrupt realization struck Naruto. They were shinobi, meaning that they guarded the village and paid special attention to any disturbances. Especially disturbances that were nearby. Naruto leapt from his seat. That was it. He knew exactly what he could do to get into the building. It was perfect. "Thanks Tasuki," Naruto called over his shoulder to the bewildered man as he dashed from the tavern. The blonde quickly made his way across the red light district and to his buildings. Once there he easily accessed the basement through a cleverly hidden entrance near the back of an empty shop. He made a beeline toward a storage room that he was now using as a workroom. It held several scrolls and numerous small sheets of paper. Naruto strode over to a small stack of square pieces of paper on the floor. They were covered in designs drawn in ink, explosion tags. Or at least Naruto's attempt at making them. The scroll on ceiling that he'd found almost a year ago had detailed, mainly, on how to make them, along with the basics of the art. It had taken Naruto a lot of trial and error to get them to look okay, even marginally correct, and he still hadn't been able to try them out yet, but he was hopeful that they would work. And now, the boy muttered to himself as he fingered the worn paper, "I have the perfect way to test them." The next morning dawned bright and early for all of Konoha, but especially for one short, blonde-haired boy. Naruto was sneaking quietly through the village using the back alleyways. When he finally reached the building, his eyes were sparkling with mischief and excitement. Naruto crouched down behind some crates in front of a building next to the building. From there he had a good view of the street, but was completely hidden from everyone. All but the most attentive of shinobi would be unable to spot him. Once in place, Naruto settled in to wait for just the right moment to act. Generally, he was very impatient, but now he would wait. For this, he would wait. Almost an hour passed for a fidgety Naruto before he saw what he'd been waiting for. A cart, filled with cabbages, was coming down the road. Grinning widely, Naruto shifted into a crouched position. He would have a window of only a few seconds to do this, so he couldn't afford any mistakes. As the cart began to pass before the building, Naruto quickly pulled out a slingshot and several explosive tags wrapped securely around rocks. He knew how to activate the tags only because of the ceiling scroll. He'd found it had explained how to call upon chakra. Naruto had absolutely no control over his chakra at this point in time, but control wasn't needed to activate a tag. Only raw power was, and that was no problem for the young boy. The blonde child fitted one of the rocks into the slingshot, took aim, and then fired. Naruto didn't even wait for the rock to hit the wheel of the cart before he shot off another one, and then another. Then, without warning, a small explosion lit up the street. It wasn't large enough to do any real damage, but the cart was sent off track and the horse pulling it promptly began to freak out. It reared up on its hind legs, screaming, and was even further frightened by the terrified screams of the people around it as they threw themselves away from the cart. Most instantly Shinobi appeared in the street in an attempt to regain order. Naruto took this chance and immediately began to thread his way through the quickly forming crowd. He slipped into the front door of the building and, just as he'd expected, there was no Shinobi there this time to stop him. Curiously, Naruto glanced about the room that he was in, which honestly reminded him of a waiting room. He poked his nose around for a minute before remembering that he didn't have much time. So instead he hurried through the main hallway that led from the room. This hallway split into several more, and so Naruto just chose one of those randomly to enter. The blonde meandered through the building for several minutes before finally coming across a metal door that was tightly sealed. He tugged on the door several times, but it refused to open. "It's locked," a rough voice behind Naruto spoke up. "Locked with chakra seals. You won't be able to get in." Instantly Naruto froze in place, terror gripping him. He had been caught red-handed and was trapped in a dead end. There was no way out of this. Ever so slowly Naruto turned around, and immediately paled further. Standing before him with his arms crossed over his chest was the man Naruto had been caught by time and time again. In the dark hallway with shadows half hiding his face, the scars covering the shinobi's head looked all the more menacing. Naruto gulped deeply. I was just, he stuttered, but the tall shinobi swiftly interrupted him. "I must say," he began, "I'm quite surprised that you managed to make it this far. Using a distraction to lure people away from the building was quite ingenious. Though, personally, I'm more curious about how you managed to get your hands on some explosive tags. Regardless, your little adventure ends here. I really should even kill you even for entering this building, or perhaps just hand you over to the police force for endangering citizens, but you've caught me in a good mood and I'm you. Saint, admit that I'm impressed by your determination. Why are you even attempting to get in here anyway?" As soon as the man had said that he wasn't going to kill him, Naruto's shoulders had dropped with relief. Thank Kami the man wasn't some sort of psycho killer. Now that the danger had mostly passed, the blonde stared inquisitively at the man before him. "I was curious," Naruto replied with a shrug. "I saw Shinobi going into the building and I wanted to know why." The shinobi stared at Naruto with a raised eyebrow before suddenly throwing his head back and letting out a booming laugh. "You're either very brave or very stupid, kid. Did it never occur to you that entering a building filled with shinobi might be dangerous?" He continued to chuckle while slowly shaking his head. "What's your name anyway?" "Uzumaki Naruto," the blonde answered while sticking his chin up defiantly. "Naruto, Well, Naruto, I'm Morino Ibiki, Chunin of Konohagakure. And you should be leaving before anyone else comes back." Naruto quickly nodded his head. He opened his mouth to thank Ibiki, only to pause when something occurred to him. He didn't know how to get out of the building. Ibiki quickly realized Naruto's dilemma and promptly slapped his forehead. "Of course," he muttered with a sigh. "Wouldn't that just be the case? Fine, I'll help you out. But only this once." Without any further ado, Ibiki placed a heavy hand on one of Naruto's shoulders, causing the young boy to jump in surprise. This was quickly forgotten however as the strangest sensation enveloped Naruto while smoke suddenly surrounded the two. Just moments later both the smoke and the feeling dissipated, leaving a gaping Naruto to stare at their new surroundings, namely the rooftops of Konoha. Ibiki chuckled at the boy's expression. "That was Shunshin body flicker technique," he told him. "It's a transportation technique." "Awesome," Naruto exclaimed, though his eyes were glued to the view around them. He'd never been on the rooftops before, and he found that the view of the expanse of Konoha was incredible. He hadn't realized just how massive the village really was. "Hey, Ibiki-san," Naruto asked without turning around. "What are shinobi doing in that building anyway?" "I couldn't tell." When he received a response, the blonde frowned and turned back to the shinobi. "Ibiki-san, there was nothing there but the sun on the roof tiles." "Ibiki, oi, how the hell am I supposed to get down from here?" Ibiki barely managed to prevent himself from squirming under the Sandaime Hokage's burning gaze. The older man was generally known as a kind man. But when he got angry, well, there was a reason why he was still the Hokage, even after all these years. "And why is this just now coming to my attention?" Sarutobi asked, his voice deceptively calm. Please explain to me now why the information of someone attempting to break into the intelligence headquarters was not deemed important enough to tell me. Cringing, Ibiki shrank back from the Hokage. Forgive me, Hokage-sama. It's just that we didn't actually expect the boy to get into the building. It was very easy to spot him while he spied on the building and even easier to prevent him from getting inside. We figured that he'd give up eventually, once he realized that his attempts were futile, but he never did. As the anger faded from Sarutobi, he seemed to deflate. So determined, he murmured with a weary sigh. Naruto-chan is turning out to be just like his father in that respect. Ibiki perked up slightly at this statement. The Sandaime knew who Naruto's father was. He was probably the only one. Very few people even thought about the fact that the young boy had parents, let alone asked who they were. Suddenly Ibiki found himself a lot more interested in the child. Morino, Sarutobi suddenly said, and Ibiki immediately snapped to attention. I doubt that Naruto will stop his investigation now. You have my permission to keep an eye on Naruto when he comes around again. Ibiki stared at the Sandaime, wondering what the elder man meant by that. He didn't ask for clarification though, as the mischievous, almost smug, glint in Sarutobi's eyes sent shivers down his spine. Because some people might be confused by this, let me explain one thing. The suffix chan is used for girls, young boys, and animals. Naruto is currently called Chan because of his age, but as he grows will be called Kun. I should also mention that Ibiki did know who Naruto was from the first time he saw him. He just pretended that he didn't because anyone, even a little boy, would find it strange if someone just randomly knew their name. Ibiki is a shinobi after all, and one that is specifically trained in deception. This chapter and the next one mainly just setting up the story and Naruto's upbringing. In Chapter 4 the main plot of the story will finally be revealed, and from there things will begin to pick up. Archive. Chapter 3, The Seals. Title: Failing Twilight. Author: Shadow Rebirth. Beta Reader: Rukia 23. Rating: T. Warnings: Death, blood and gore, coarse language, adult themes, spoilers. Chapter WC 4069. Story WC 12033. First written May 31, 2008. Last edited February 21, 2009. Posted October 24, 2008. Summary: Naruto had learnt from a young age that life could get hectic, but all this chaos with Biju, daimyos, and psychotic missing nin was going a bit too far. Now just throw in a fourth great shinobi war and you've got one pissed off seal master. Oh story, no pairings. Failing Twilight. Chapter 3, The Seals. Naruto could clearly remember the exact moment that he had decided to become a shinobi. Even many years later the event would still be engraved into his memories. The day had been a bright, sunny afternoon, and Naruto had been walking through the streets of Konoha when he had come across a brawl taking place in the middle of the road. There was nothing particularly strange or vicious about the fight, but then again, it wasn't the fight itself that caught Naruto's attention. Just as Naruto came upon the scene, two black-cloaked figures appeared among the crowd. Their faces were covered by terrifying porcelain masks depicting different animals. Anbu. Before Naruto's eyes the two Anbu easily and efficiently broke up the fight and began to turn away the crowd of spectators that had formed. The people all around immediately complied, and Naruto saw the respect and awe reflected in their eyes. In that moment Naruto knew that he wanted to become a shinobi. To command such respect and power, Naruto would become a shinobi. He would become an Anbu. Naruto took to the streets once more, heading home. He hadn't gone too far however when he caught sight of a familiar bandana, and instantly an idea made itself present in his mind. Eyes alight with determination he quickly dashed forward. Ibiki-san, Naruto called as he skidded to a stop next to the shinobi. Ibiki-san, you've got to help me. Ibiki looked down at the blonde while groaning. Naruto, he groused, will you please stop bothering me? I helped you out once and now you're showing up almost everywhere I go. This is different, Naruto said, waving off Ibiki's protests. I need your help. Help? Ibiki asked with a quirked eyebrow. Yes, I want to become a shinobi, and you're the only shinobi I know, so. Ibiki snorted. I'm not the only shinobi you know because I don't know you. You're just an annoying brat that's taken to following me around, he said. Naruto just continued to stare at him, undeterred. Ibiki Street. Ared back for several minutes before finally letting his head drop down and groaning. Fine, he snapped. I'll help you, but on one condition. Naruto nodded eagerly. Of course, he exclaimed. Anything, anything. Ibiki pulled out a scroll from one of the pockets of his Chunin vest and handed it to Naruto. This scroll contains instructions for the Henjutsu transformation technique technique that all academy students learn. If you can master it in a week, then I promise to do everything I can to help you get into the Shinobi Academy. Naruto took the scroll excitedly. Cool, I'll definitely have this done in a week. No problem. Thanks Ibiki-san. Ibiki chuckled quietly as Naruto ran off. He didn't believe for a second that the boy would be able to master the technique at all at his age, let alone in only a week. The boy probably couldn't even read being a 6-year-old orphan and all, and even if he could, it took years of training for academy students to be able to just call upon and control chakra. Let alone be able to mold it to form a jutsu. Once he failed, hopefully the blonde would stop bothering him so much. Ibiki's eyes slowly slid over to the Hokage Tower, which could be seen peeking over the tops of the nearby buildings. There was, however, something that was bothering him, a question that was lurking in the back of his mind. As one may guess, Ibiki was Ot1 to randomly carry around a scroll containing a D-rank jutsu. As a matter of fact, the scroll had been given to him just a few weeks ago by the Hokage, who told him to give it to Naruto when the time was right. But how had the older man known that this would happen? That Naruto would try to become a shinobi? Sure, the boy was already as sneaky and creative as a shinobi, but he was still just a child. Could it be because he was the Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi no Kitsune? No, that didn't make any sense. Just what did the Hokage have up his sleeve? While Ibiki contemplated the motives of the wily old Hokage, Naruto was swiftly making his way toward his home. Once there, he entered what he dubbed his work room, which was a fairly large room filled with scrolls, books, and tables. He walked over to one of the tables and quickly swept all the papers there to the side to clear a space for the scroll, which he promptly opened. The first roadblock that Naruto ran into was the problem of hand seals, which he'd never used before. Fortunately, the scroll Ibiki had given to him also detailed how to form the hand seals for the jutsu, so he only had to practice them until he managed to get them right. It was too bad that there was no one to help him with the hand seals, but he'd always figured out everything else on his own, right? For the next 3 days Naruto barely slept, hardly ate. If it hadn't been for his stash of microwavable ramen and the microwave that he'd moved from his apartment, then he probably wouldn't have eaten at all, and focused all of his attention on attempting to get the jutsu to work. The only problem now was that no matter what Naruto did, the jutsu just wouldn't work. He understood the hand seals and could call up his chakra easily enough, but after that, the chakra would just slip through his fingers, impossible to control. He attempted to force the chakra to mold into the jutsu as the scroll described, but it never worked. It was almost akin to dealing with a wild animal. It was wild and untamable. Naruto growled lowly while glaring hard at the scroll before him. This was really starting to piss him off, and his impatience was beginning to win over. The blonde let out a deep sigh and allowed his head to fall forward onto the table with a thump. He sat there, unmoving, for several seconds before lifting his head again and promptly scowled when an explosive tag came up with him stuck to his forehead. Naruto peeled off the piece of paper and then glared at it in annoyance. If he could get written seals to work, then why not hand seals too? After all, they were basically the same. Instantly, Naruto's thoughts grinded to a screeching halt. The same. They were the same. In a flurry of movement, Naruto burst into action, quickly snapping up his sealing scroll while pushing others aside to make room. Once the scroll was laid out before him, he began to excitedly scan through the text. Why hadn't he thought of this before? According to the sealing scroll, seals worked because they used a medium, either ink or blood, to channel chakra into the form it was supposed to take. Hand seals did basically the same thing, but they traded control our speed and allowed the chakra to run free. It was the person that controlled the chakra then, instead of the ink. But the point of the matter was that both forms of seals could end up with the same result. So what was stopping him from performing the Henge no Jutsu with written seals instead of hand seals? In theory it'd actually be an even better version because it couldn't be dispelled because the chakra flow couldn't be disrupted by anyone other than the seal's creator. All Naruto needed to do now was figure out how to translate hand seals into written seals. And hence he came upon his Seiko ND roadblock. He knew what he needed to do, but not how to do it. Naruto started out by studying how each and every hand seal molded chakra. This was incredibly difficult, but after hour of molding chakra he finally began to notice how the flows of energy within his body changed with each seal. It seemed to be the sort of thing that one had to practice to be able to recognize. Next, the blonde tried to figure out how the seals he'd been practicing making, namely explosion tags, molded chakra. This was by far the most difficult part, and in the end he just had to work with trial and error by taking out and adding different parts of the seal. Of course, unknown to the boy doing this, it was extremely dangerous and it was highly likely that he'd manage to blow himself up. He'd always add an inordinate amount of luck, though unfortunately it didn't fail him now. At the end of the week Naruto lay on the floor of his workroom, exhausted. And for the small bundle of energy, exhausted meant exhausted. Naruto had spent the past several days attempting to get his henge seals to work. It had been nearly impossible, but in the end he'd accomplished his goal. Or at least he hoped he had. He still needed to test out the final product. Speaking of which, with a series of grunts Naruto managed to drag himself off the floor. Despite his screaming muscles he stumbled over to a cracked mirror inserted in one wall. He then took one of the seals in his hand and channeled a relatively small amount of chakra into it. Naruto waited and nothing happened. The chakra went into the seal and then simply dissipated. His appearance didn't change. The blonde glared down at the seal, furious. How could this happen? His mind screamed. He'd been so sure that it'd work this time, so sure that he'd finally gotten it right. He didn't have any more time to experiment. He had to be able to perform the jutsu by tonight. And failure was not an option. Naruto was about to stomp back over to the scrolls when suddenly his steps faltered and he glanced back over to the mirror. What if the seal just required more physical contact? Explosion tag seals only needed chakra to be channeled into them to work. But the henge jutsu worked on a single person, so obviously it would work differently. It would make sense for the chakra to just dissipate if it didn't have a direction to go in. Well, it was worth a shot at least. Hesitantly at first, Naruto brought his hand up and slapped the seal on the center of his chest and then held it there so that all of the paper was in contact with his skin. Then, while holding his breath, he channeled his chakra into the seal. He promptly gasped in surprise. It felt as though an electric shock had run through his body. It didn't really hurt, but it certainly was surprising. This shock was completely forgotten, however, when he glanced up at the mirror. It had worked. Instead of his normal blue-eyed, blonde-haired visage, his reflection was now that of a nondescript dark-eyed and dark-haired boy. The whisker-like scars on his cheeks had also disappeared and his face was a bit narrower than normal. In short, he looked completely different. Mindless of his earlier exhaustion, Naruto let out a triumphant yell. He'd succeeded. That in itself was worth more than getting into the academy ever would. Not a half an hour later, Naruto stood outside of the building with a wide grin on his face. There were more shinobi guards around than usual, he noticed, but this time he simply ignored their presence. Instead, he flounced up to the front doors and confidently stepped inside. This time the front room was not empty, but instead a black-clad kunoichi sat inside, reading from a scroll. Once Naruto had entered, she stared blankly at him for several long moments before realization dawned in her eyes and she began to chuckle in amusement. The kunoichi spoke no words, but stood fluidly from her seat and beckoned Naruto with one hand. Still chuckling, she began to lead him further into the complex. Within several minutes, during which time they made so many twists and turns that Naruto was invariably lost. He wasn't even sure if they were on ground level anymore. The kunoichi brought Naruto to a hallway lined with doors. She stopped before one that was just as indistinguishable as the rest, knocked solidly on it once, and then Had the door open without waiting for a reply. On the other side of the door was a small office containing one desk filled with paperwork and several large filing cabinets. Sitting behind the desk, working diligently, was none other than Ibiki. The scarred Chunin glanced up when the door opened, only to do a double take when he caught sight of Naruto, a look of shock appearing on his face. The coup. Noichi let out a few snickers and then swiftly left the room, closing the door behind her as she did so. No, Ibiki said once they were alone, there's no way you managed to master the jutsu. Grinning wordlessly, Naruto brought his hands up and began to run through the hand seals for the henge jutsu. Instead of letting the hand seals mold his chakra, however, he channeled it into the seal on his chest, hidden beneath his shirt. As the jutsu activated this time, the shock more of a tingle really didn't surprise him. If Ibiki's gaping visage was anything to go by, however, his change certainly had shocked the man. Why, you mastered it, Ibiki exclaimed. He opened and closed his mouth several times, looking as though he wanted to say something else, but never did. Finally, after several minutes, the Chunin managed to compose himself. Well, I did agree to help you, he said grudgingly, omitting the fact that he hadn't actually expected Naruto to succeed. I'll help you get into the academy. I'll even talk to the Hokage about it for you. I won't, however, be able to help you with getting the equipment and required books. You'll have to get the money for that on your own. Naruto quickly nodded his agreement. Of course. What else do I have to do? He asked. Ibiki let out a sigh. Nothing, at this point. Come around again in a few weeks and I should have you registered for the academy. Oh, and Naruto, don't tell anyone that I've helped you, it'll ruin the reputation that I've been trying to build. With his get into the academy plan fulfilled, Naruto was faced with just one last problem. How to get money for equipment. The monthly stipend he received was barely even enough for him as it was, so he was going to have to find some other way to get the cash. And so Naruto tried his hand at poker. And failed miserably. It seemed that while he was getting to be an expert at reading other people, he couldn't hide his own emotions to save his life. Naruto decided to continue to play poker in order to practice. But he was going to have to find some other way to make money for the time being. Naruto then turned to the only other option he could think of, getting a job. The problem with this was that no one would hire a 6-year-old. It was only through Haru's recommendation that he managed to procure a job working for a blacksmith. The work was simple enough, fetching things for Kenmaru, the blacksmith. Cleaning blades, cleaning the shop, stocking the shelves, etc., but it paid good money. Naruto also had a deal with Kenmaru to get all of his equipment from the shop when fall came. And with it the start of school. Naruto groaned as he wiped the sweat from his forehead for what seemed like the 100th time. It was always sweltering in the blacksmith's shop that he worked in. But with it now being mid-July as well, the heat was almost unbearable. Naruto let out a small breath of air and swiftly moved to his feet from where he'd been crouched in front of a shelf. Stacking a few small boxes on top of each other. He only had to finish tidying up the front part of the shop. The back part was the smithy where Kenmaru worked, while the front was the store, and then he could leave for the day. He only had a little bit more to do, so it shouldn't be very long. At that moment the bells attached to the front door rang, signaling someone's entrance. Naruto jerked up, surprised, and then quickly began to maneuver his way around the shelves toward the door. Kenmaru-senpai is in the back right now, the young boy called out as he approached. If you'll just wait a moment I can go get him. And Naruto halted abruptly as he came in sight of the front door. Standing there was a nervous young girl about his age with long brown hair. The blonde blinked in surprise at seeing such a young girl in a blacksmith's shop, and she seemed to be just as surprised to see him. Oh, Naruto said blankly. You're just a kid, what are you doing here? The girl drew back, surprised. Hey, she exclaimed, you're young too and you're here. Yeah, but you're a girl. So, the girl snarled, stomping her foot, I'm already in the Shinobi Academy. I'm starting my 2nd year in September. I haven't seen you at the academy. Naruto flushed bright red. That's because I'm starting this year. I'm just 6 right now. Ha, the girl pointed at the Naruto triumphantly. I'm 7 and will be 8 in March. I'm older than you and a better shinobi. Stupid, you're not a shinobi yet. And who says you're better than me? I could beat you with my eyes closed. Oh yeah, just try to scratch me. Is there a problem here? Another voice suddenly said, instantly breaking up the small fight between the two children. Naruto froze for just a second before quickly ducking his head in embarrassment. He peeked between his long blonde bangs up at the man standing next to them. He was somewhat tall, reaching just over 6 feet, and had a wiry frame. He had graying hair, a crooked nose, and a pointed little goatee. He looked more like a shinobi than a blacksmith, but his muscles held surprising strength. Sorry, Kenmaru-senpai, Naruto said while ducking his head again. And without looking he could feel the elder man's steel-colored eyes boring into him. You know better than this, Naruto-chan, Kenmaru scolded. Always treat all customers with utmost respect. Naruto flinched as the blacksmith's words. Yes, Kenmaru-senpai. Kenmaru released a slow sigh. Go clean up the back, Naruto-chan. I'll deal with things here. Wordlessly, Naruto ducked his head once more and then quickly fled from the scene. Despite this embarrassing first encounter, the young girl returned to the shop again not a week later. Naruto and the girl's Tenten, she told him encounter was much quieter this time. And they quickly got into talking about weaponry. I want to become a weapon master. Tenten exclaimed happily. That's why I'm here, to check out prices. My father said he'd pay for the weapons I want. But only a couple right now. Naruto titled his head to the side in confusion. Weapon master. What's that mean? It's a shinobi who specializes in using weapons. Kinda like how a taijutsu master specializes in taijutsu. But, Naruto said while tapping his chin thoughtfully, won't that narrow the field of what you can do? Tenten shrugged. Maybe, but it's much more interesting. And you don't have to use jutsu to be deadly. What about you? Would you rather be a jack of all trades or something? Naruto took a moment to seriously consider this. Maybe, he mused. The thought of his seals danced through his mind and he wondered if he'd rather be a seal master. Maybe, Naruto, Tenten asked while waving a hand in front of Naruto's eyes. The blonde jumped in, surprised and then realized that he must have been lost in thought. Sorry, Naruto exclaimed. He turned around and began leading Tenten through some of the shelves. Come on, you said that you wanted to look at some of the ninjutsu and katana, right? Tenten nodded happily. And some of the axes too. And maybe some sickles. The brown-haired girl paused to glance at Naruto. Hey, Naruto, why are you working here? You're only 6 years old after all. Naruto stopped suddenly, but didn't turn to look at the young girl. His head hung down so that his expression was shadow. And suddenly Tenten felt a wave of apprehension wash over her. Was it a taboo subject? Should she have not asked? To Tenten's surprise, when Naruto finally rose his head and looked at her there was smile on his face so wide that his eyes were closed. It's just good practice is all. The blonde replied. If I'm going to be a shinobi then it's good to know a lot about weapons. Plus it's nice to have extra money, even as a kid. Tenten let out a sigh of relief and then quickly brightened. Well, come on, she said while rushing ahead of the blonde. Let's go look at those blades. As Tenten moved ahead of him, Naruto's smile dropped and he opened his eyes to reveal that they were several shades darker than usual. The boy let out a nearly inaudible sigh. Naruto didn't like deceiving Tenten like that, but, while the girl knew that he was an orphan, she really didn't understand just what it was like to have to support yourself at such a young age. Kenmaru's shop was in a nicer part of town, so she also didn't know just where he lived and what his life was like. Naruto just didn't want to drop the burdens of his life onto her. If he could cover his pain up with a smile, then he'd do so. Chuckling quietly to himself, Naruto raced after Tenten. So, Naruto-chan, I heard that ya made a new friend. Naruto looked up at Tasuki in surprise. How do you know? Tasuki chuckled and took a bite of the ramen he was eating. Currently he and Naruto were sitting in Ichiraku Ramen, having lunch together. The scarred man claimed that it was because he didn't get to see Naruto much beyond the occasional poker game. Well, Tasuki said as he swallowed. I heard it from that blacksmith guy ya work fair. Ken whatever, Kenmaru, Naruto supplied instantly. Yeah, I am. So it's true den. Tasuki smirked down at Naruto. Naruto-chan's got himself a girlfriend. Immediately Naruto began to protest furiously. She's just a friend, he said loudly, and even then, Naruto trailed off, staring at the ground. Tasuki tilted his head to the side curiously. It's just that. Sometimes. Naruto-chan. Wordlessly, Naruto shook his head and returned to eating his ramen. Nothing, he mumbled. Tasuki stared down at the blonde curiously for a minute before finally shaking his head and turning away as well. Naruto stared down into his food as he ate. Honestly, he wasn't entirely sure if he could call Tenten a friend. Sure, she thought of him as a friend and came often to Kenmaru's shop, but sometimes Naruto wasn't sure if he could really get along with her. It was just little words here and small actions there that made him realize the difference between them. Naruto had grown up in the world of adults. The people he was around every day were adults, often of the worst sort. Though he hadn't noticed it at first, this had caused Naruto to mature differently than most kids his age. He was already viewing the world from a different point of view than someone like Tenten, who had grown up with loving, shinobi parents. Certainly Naruto still liked Tenten and would continue to hang out with her, but sometimes the difference in their maturity was just too great. And that made Naruto wonder, what was going to happen when he started attending school? How on earth was he going to get along with the other kids there? I hope T. Happy explanations about how seals work made sense, cause there will be a lot more about them in this story. If there's anything that anyone didn't understand, please don't hesitate to ask me. I didn't originally mean for there to be so many OCs in this story. Tasuki, Haru, and Kenmaru will be the main ones though, and the only ones you'll need to remember, so that shouldn't be a problem. Arc I. Chapter 4, The Academy. Title: Failing Twilight Author. Shadow Rebirth Beta Reader. Rukia 23 Rating. T. Warnings: death, blood and gore, coarse language, adult themes, spoilers. Chapter WC 8104 Story WC 20137. First written June 10, 2008. Last edited February 21, 2009. Posted October 28, 2008. Summary: Naruto had learnt from a young age that life could get hectic, but all this chaos with Biju, daimyos, and psychotic missing nin was going a bit too far. Now just throw in a 4th grade shinobi war and you've got one pissed off seal master. Oh story, no pairings. Failing Twilight Chapter 4, The Academy. Naruto's first day of school was a bit of a letdown in his opinion. He'd been so excited to enter the academy, to be a shinobi, but nothing turned out the way he'd expected it to. The first morning he raced to the shinobi academy with a smile on his face. He was wearing new clothes that he'd bought, namely a pair of dark green cargo pants that reached just past his knees, a black t-shirt, and a pair of shinobi sandals. With him he carried several sets of kunai and shuriken and the required textbook. When the blonde reached the building he found many parents and their children milling around. He slowed down to a trot but didn't allow his excitement to diminish. They may not be with him, but Kenmaru, Haru, Tasuki, and everyone else at the Black Wolf Tov. Had already wished him luck the night before. Naruto easily weaved his way through the crowd and to the front doors. Ibiki had told him that he needed to go to room 108, so he made his way there. Along the way he eyed the other children that he came across. They would be his classmates for the next 5 or so years. The first disappointment that Naruto encountered was at the beginning of class week. Their teacher announced that they wouldn't be doing anything practical until the next year. The first academy year would be spent learning the basics that all civilians learned, including reading, writing, math, etc. Naruto was impatient to get to the actual shinobi stuff, but there was nothing that he could do about it. Following that, the rest of the day continued to go downhill. Not only was very thing that they talked about boring and stuff that he already knew, but when he attempted to read the textbook to learn something new, the teacher who'd been ignoring him up until that point immediately caught him and then spent the next 10 minutes lecturing him about paying attention while the rest of the class snickered. Because of these events, the children in his class ignored him when they were let outside for lunch, out of fear of earning the teacher's ire as well. Even those who might have become friends with the blonde then stayed away from him. Naruto spent a little while speaking with a couple of older students while eating a lunch of packaged ramen, the cheapest thing he could buy, but found that, just as he feared, he couldn't quite connect with them. He'd spent so much time around adults that he was no longer sure how to deal with kids his own age. Despite the great flop that was his first day of school, Naruto returned the next morning with the same excited and determined attitude. He'd spent so much effort trying to get into the academy that he wasn't going to quit now. He would become a shinobi even if it killed him. The next few months were interesting for Naruto, to say the least. Though he tried to follow along with the lessons, boredom paired with the innate dislike that his teachers seemed to have for him generally hindered this. Eventually Naruto found himself studying outside of class more often than not. This led to him occasionally falling asleep in class when he'd spent the previous night up late, usually either reading from his textbook or experimenting with seals. Strangely enough, Naruto's teachers didn't seem to mind him sleeping in class. If anything, they were glad for it because it meant that they didn't have to deal with the blonde-haired child. Because of this discovery, Naruto's life quickly fell into a rhythm of doing his work outside of school and then catching up on sleep in school. It was very beneficial for him. The only problem with this was that Naruto's grades suffered. Sure, he tended to ace all the tests they took, but his sleeping in class coupled with the occasional times he skipped school altogether caused his participation grades to be almost non-existent. Naturally, this led to Naruto's grades hanging in the middle range. He wasn't failing, but neither was he excelling. Honestly, Naruto couldn't bring himself to care. After all, it was what he learned that mattered, not what they said about him on paper. As fall passed and winter set in, life settled down and Naruto found himself enjoying it. With a yawn, Naruto stretched his hands above his head. Considering the late hour, the 7-year-old had a very good reason to be yawning. Naruto was sitting on the smooth floor of his workroom, papers spread out around him. The boy was shirtless despite the fact that it was currently the dead of winter, mainly because he'd recently been exercising and had worked up quite a sweat. The basements held heat in surprisingly well, though better than his old apartment had, anyway. Naruto let out another yawn and then peered blearily down at the small piece of paper in his hand, a henge seal, to be precise. Naruto had been spending his evening trying to get the henge to work with hand seals. Of course, he'd been unsuccessful. Naruto was not comforted by this in the slightest. While it was true that he could just use drawn seals for the jutsu, he needed to be able to perform them with hand seals. The blonde knew from personal experience that fights were very unpredictable and one couldn't take the time to draw up a seal in the middle of battle, especially not when the slightest mistake could cause it to blow up in your face. Naruto had already had that experience more than enough already, thank you very much. It was for this very reason that hand seals had been invented. They were so much more practical. Naruto set the henge seal down on the floor, next to several others. Ibiki had mentioned to him once Naruto still bugged the Chunin almost weekly, half for homework help, half because it was just so much fun that chakra control was vital when it came to performing jutsu. As knowledge about seals as the boy was, he understood this. The only problem was actually learning how to control his chakra. It really was too bad that they wouldn't be even talking about chakra for another year in the academy. If only there was another way for him to learn. Naruto pushed those thoughts to the back of his head and began to go through the hand seals for the henge jutsu, forming with surprising speed for a 7-year-old. The only thing that he could do now was practice the jutsu in hope of making a breakthrough, so practice he would. Just as Naruto began to channel chakra, the blonde came to an abrupt halt. His hands held up in mid-seal, he stared at the smooth expanse of his abdomen. He could have sworn that he'd seen something there, if only for a moment. But surely he'd just imagined it. The young boy focused back on his hands and restarted the hand seal for the henge jutsu, only to quickly halt again. There, he'd definitely seen something this time, if only from the corner of his eye. Hesitantly the blonde poked his stomach and then let out a somewhat relieved breath of air when nothing happened. Naruto took several moments to glare down at his stomach. Damn it, he knew he'd seen something there. How could it just disappear and then reappear like that? Realization struck Naruto like a bolt of lightning. Both times he'd been performing hand seals, so maybe. Without looking up, Naruto began to run through the hand seal once more. Instantaneously a black shape flared into existence on his skin. Even though he'd been half expecting it, Naruto let out a yelp of surprise and inadvertently cut off the flow of chakra. As he did so, the tattoo, for Naruto didn't really know what else to call it, disappeared. For several long moments Naruto sat perfectly still, his heart beating wildly in his chest. What in Kami's name had that been? He was tempted to ignore the strange occurrence and get back to his studying in hopes that it'd go away, but of course it wasn't long before his natural curiosity overrode this. Besides, it had been on his body, so surely it couldn't be dangerous. With building confidence, Naruto once again began to channel his chakra and this time held it. Before Naruto's wide eyes the tattoo sprang up. Curious, Naruto eyed the strange shape closely, and promptly let out a gasp. That was no tattoo. It was a seal, an insanely complex seal unlike anything he'd ever seen before. But why was there a seal on his abdomen? And why scratch that? How did it only show up when he channeled chakra? Naruto let out a sigh as he released his chakra and let his hands drop into his lap. Great, as if his life hadn't been hectic enough already without adding strange seals into the mix. Following his discovery, Naruto began to put a lot of energy into figuring out what the seal on his stomach was. He started out by carefully copying the seal onto paper and then began the lengthy process of taking the seal apart piece by piece to figure out what it did. Considering the complexity of the seal, that was going to take quite a while. Before long, however, Naruto ran into a major roadblock. As much as he knew about seals, all of that knowledge came from a single scroll in his experiments. And that wasn't anywhere near enough to unravel this seal. So imagine Naruto's joy when he learned one day in the academy that Konoha had a library where all sorts of information was stored, including information on seals. The second school let out well, an hour before it did, to be honest, but that didn't matter to Naruto. The blonde rushed over to the library and was promptly denied access. As it turned out, the library was for shinobi only, which meant that you had to have a shinobi ID card to get in. Of course there was a public library, but Naruto knew beyond the shadow of a doubt the kind of information that he was looking for wouldn't be there. Faced with this problem, Naruto decided to try to find another way into the library. Naturally, Tsuki had told him once, almost a year ago now, that one often just had to look at a problem from another point of view. Naruto intended to do just that. Step by step Naruto slowly inched his way along a smooth wall. When he came to the corner of the building he peeked his head around it and quickly glanced over the alley there. Only once he was sure that no one was there did he slip quietly into the alley. Naruto continued to move flush against the wall while inside the alley. He was behind the library now, so all he needed to do was find an entrance and before his thoughts could go any further, Naruto's foot suddenly brushed against glass. Glancing down in surprise, the boy found that there was a small window where the building met the ground, the type meant to give ventilation to basements. He crouched down and, with only a small push, managed to open the window. Naruto rolled his eyes. It figured that shinobi would focus so much attention on rooftops, where they frequented, and that they would ignore the ground. Though it took a bit of wriggling around, Naruto was a small enough boy that he was able to fit through the thin window. Once through, he dropped to the floor in heap. He lay there for a moment before pushing himself to his feet with a grumble. At least no one had been there to hear him. He really needed to work on his landing. Due to the small amount of light shining through the small window and two others like it, Naruto was able to look around the room. It was a basement, but a rather large one filled with countless bookshelves. Due to the lack of he figured that this was just the lower level of the library. Moving swiftly in case anyone had heard his entry, Naruto began to scan the bookshelves. It took almost a half an hour of fruitless searching though, granted. He had found a couple of books and scrolls that he was interested in reading before the blonde struck gold. Tucked away in one of the corners was a section on sealing. While there weren't any advanced texts there, it was still more than he could have hoped for. A large grin on his face, Naruto settled down on the floor to read. When Naruto yawned for the fourth time in just as many minutes, he decided that it was time to head home. He'd had a very productive night after all, and he'd be able to come back every night that he wanted to, now that he'd found a way in. Naruto clambered to his feet and stretched his arms in the air as another yawn cracked his jaw. Yep, definitely time to go home. He swiftly replaced the texts he'd been using and then headed back over to the window. With only a little bit of difficulty and liberal use of the nearby bookshelf as a ladder, he managed to get back outside. The young boy moved quietly through the alley as he had while searching for an entrance. He got to the corner of the building and started to peer around, only to freeze in shock as a black-clad shinobi with spiky obsidian hair landed in a crouch before him. The man looked over his shoulder, as if expecting to be followed, and barely even glanced at Naruto before moving to jump away again. Except that he didn't. Instead, that dark man did a double take and began to stare at the blonde child. After only a minute, he suddenly began to chuckle. Naruto gulped. The laughter was not a pleasant sound. Well, what's this?" the man asked somewhat smugly. As he spoke, he crossed his arms over his chest and leaned against the wall in a position that was relaxed but also seemed to scream danger to Naruto. The blonde desperately wanted to run away, but it felt as though his feet had been glued to the ground. What terrified Naruto the most about the shinobi was his eyes. They were blood red with a strange geometrical shape inside them. Pure malice radiated from those eyes, and Naruto felt as though it'd be better to die standing where he was rather than have to continue to stare into those bottomless pits of hell. Fortunately, Naruto's train of thought was broken by another bout of laughter from the terrifying man. "Uzumaki Naruto," the dark-haired shinobi mused, and Naruto gulped again. How the hell did he know his name? "It'd be a shame to have to kill you," he continued. "Though I suppose that will come in due time." Naruto's confusion increased exponentially, and he felt a small amount of anger beginning to well up within him. What the hell was he talking about? How could he mention killing him so casually? The man seemed to pick up on Naruto's confusion, and a dark smirk curled at the corners of his lips. "I suppose you wouldn't know, he murmured. "Well then, allow me to explain. You see, I am Uchiha Madara, formerly of the Uchiha clan." The man, Madara, paused here as if that was some private joke. "I am the leader of a very special organization called Akatsuki. I am the most powerful shinobi in the world, and my power shall only be increased once we manage to gather all the Biju in this world. Why should I care? What does that matter to me?" Naruto managed to spit out. In hindsight, it was fairly stupid to antagonize a man as clearly unbalanced as Madara was, but at the time he'd been fueled by fear and anger. "Why, Naruto-chan, you should care very much." Madara responded with a dark smile. "After all, it concerns you. You are the container for the Kyuubi no Kitsune." Naruto's eyes widened in shock. What are you, Ma?" Dara released a laugh that sounded more than a bit insane. "Why, Naruto-chan, haven't you noticed?" The man began while taking a step forward. Naruto attempted to take a step back, but in his terror and confusion tripped over his feet and fell back onto the cold ground. "You're not entirely human. You see, the Yondaime couldn't kill the Kyuubi Biju or immortal, after all. So instead he had to seal it inside of something. And that something was you. You're lying." Naruto stammered desperately. He didn't want to believe a word Madara was saying, but inside of him memories of cold stares from the villagers, of his strange healing ability, and of the strange seal came to his mind unbidden. "Oh Kami," the young boy shuddered as bile rose in his throat. "Oh, Kami, no, single quote. You know the truth," Madara pushed on. Despite the child's reaction, he took 2 more steps forward, but Naruto once again found himself frozen in place as he stared up at the shinobi before him. "And it's a good thing that you do know. As I said, my organization will be collecting all the Biju. But unfortunately this has turned out to be quite a bit easier and duller than I'd expected. No one's been able to put up a good enough fight. So, Naruto-chan, we won't be coming for you quite yet. Don't doubt for a second that we will come, just not yet." Madara crouched down in front of Naruto and smirked at the terrified boy, his crimson eyes whirling. "But now that you know what you are and what will happen, I expect you to grow strong. Grow into your potential as a Jinchuriki, Naruto-chan. Then when we Oh, come for you, maybe you'll put up enough of a fight to actually be interesting. The Uchiha threw back his head and let out a harsh, bark-like laugh. Then the man disappeared without even a whisper of a sound, leaving a terrified child lying on the ground with his heart pounding in his ears. The next day Uchiha Sasuke, one of Naruto's classmates, didn't come to school. 2 days later Naruto would find out why. The Uchiha clan had been massacred. The evening after Naruto's fateful encounter with Uchiha Madara found the young blonde sitting on a barstool in the Black Wolf Tavern. His face was uncharacteristically solemn and his eyes were glued to the wood of the counter before him. Haru had left Naruto alone for the past few hours, hoping that the boy would be able to work out whatever was bothering him. Once it became clear that this was not going to be the case, however, the middle-aged barkeeper had someone go fetch Tasuki. Hopefully he would be able to help Naruto. When Tasuki arrived he made a beeline for Naruto. He said nothing, however, even as he took a seat at the bar next to the blonde. Naruto glanced up once at the man before looking back down, still silent. The two sat this for several minutes until Naruto was startled by a sudden motion from Tasuki. He jumped and stared at the man, but quickly relaxed when it turned out that Tasuki was just pulling out a cigarette and lighting it. The scarred man took a long drag and then turned to stare at Naruto as he released the smoke. "So," he said finally. "What's up?" Naruto glanced back down at the bar counter, but found that he couldn't go back to his silence, not with Tasuki staring at him like he was. Finally, after several tense moments the blonde let out a sigh and turned around to fully face his older friend. "Am I the container for the Kyuubi?" Naruto asked bluntly. Whatever Tasuki had been expecting, it hadn't been that. The scarred man chocked slightly and then let out several harsh coughs while pounding on his chest. As he did so he quickly glanced around the room to make sure that no one had heard what the boy had said. Meanwhile, Naruto let out a sigh. Tasuki's reaction had pretty much confirmed what Madara had told him. "So it's true," he muttered quietly, resigning himself to being a Jinchuriki, as Madara had called him. Of course he'd already come to this conclusion on his own with the seal on his stomach. His whisker marks, and the coincidence of his birthday being on the day of the Kyuubi's attack, among other things, there wasn't much room for doubt, but it was nice to have it confirmed anyway. Tasuki looked at the blonde hesitantly. His eyes searched Naruto's face for any signs of what had brought this up, but all he found there was resignation and grim determination. Asuki echoed Naruto's sigh with one of his own. Oh boy, he hadn't thought that he'd have to have this conversation. "Yeah," Tasuki said quietly. He leaned over the counter, his arms crossed on the wood before him. But met Naruto's gaze without flinching. "You are. Why wasn't I ever told? There's a law, one that I'm probably breaking right now just by speaking to you about it," Tasuki replied with a snort. "But it's not like I've never broken the law before. Anyway, after the sealing, the Sandaime made a law saying that no one could speak about what had happened on pain of death. It was written down in the history books that the Yondaime had killed the Kyuubi instead of sealing it away." Naruto nodded absently as he mulled over this information in his mind. He couldn't help but wonder why the Sandaime had done this. Wouldn't it be easier to just kill him and be done with it? "This whole Jinchuriki thing actually explains a lot," Naruto said quietly, almost to himself. Tasuki watched the blonde from the corner of his eye as he spoke but didn't interrupt. "As an orphan I lived the first 4 years of my life in an orphanage. I was treated fine and got along great with the other kids. But the adults always seemed hesitant around me. They dealt with me as little as they could and tended to ignore me when possible. When I was 4 I was given an apartment to live in. Usually doesn't happen until orphans are quite a bit older. I was told that it was because there were so many orphans that they had too little room, which was true, but now I can see that it was because they wanted to get me out of there." Quote. Tasuki reached over and ruffled Naruto's hair. "Yeah, well you're with us now, kid. And I'm sorry to say that once the red light district sinks its teeth into ya, it never lets go." Naruto let out a bright laugh and ducked away from Tasuki's hand. "I wouldn't have it any other way," he agreed, his spirits suitably lifted. "Oi, Haru," Tasuki called while motioning the barkeeper over. "How about some sake, I think that Naruto-kun is finally starting to grow up, and what better way to celebrate? Naruto continued to laugh even as a traditional wooden cup was shoved into his hands. And if there was a somewhat hysteric and relieved note in his voice, no one commented on it. Here, he was accepted. As winter turned into spring, Naruto threw himself into his training with more enthusiasm than most humans had. Previously he'd been training and studying because he wanted to become an Anbu. Now, however, he had a motivation that far outstripped that: survival. Naruto knew without the shadow of a doubt that Uchiha Madara and this Akatsuki would come for him one day. And as weak as he currently was, he wouldn't survive another such encounter. So, instead Naruto began to train past his breaking point in hopes that when the day came that he had to face those crimson eyes again, he'd be ready. Despite his fear, Naruto told no one of his encounter with Madara. Half of this was because he wasn't even sure if anyone would believe him, but it was also because it was his problem to deal with. Naruto didn't want to get anyone else involved with the mad Uchiha. Due to his suddenly insane training and study regimen, Naruto found himself spending less and less time at the academy. Instead he practically moved into the library and spent all of his time researching seals and once the second year of the academy started, jutsu. Also with the start of fall came two major accomplishments that Naruto was quite proud of. 1. He managed to perform the Henjutsu with hand seals. He was beyond pleased with this, considering the amount of time spent mastering the jutsu. 2 was that he finally found out why it had been so difficult for him to perform jutsu with hand seals. As it turned out, Naruto had atrocious chakra control. It was normal for children to have very little control over their chakra, but Naruto's was far worse than normal. Now he better understood how chakra worked, the boy realized that he had a massive amount of chakra. And with large amounts of energy came little control. The problem was that Naruto didn't know how to fix this. So instead he turned to one thing that he did know how to do, and quite well at that. Namely, annoying Ibiki. Please, Naruto whined as he followed the older Chunin through the streets of Konoha's shopping district. Please Ibiki. Damn it, Naruto. No, 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 no. Ibiki snarled in reply. He didn't even turn around to face his antagonist. But you have before, why not now? The blonde asked. Though it wouldn't be clear to anyone passing by, he was attempting to get Ibiki to give him another jutsu scroll. The man had done so several times before, but he was refusing point blank now. Ibiki made a sharp turn and stopped in front of a fruit stand. He glared heavily at Naruto, causing the boy to quail slightly and take a step back, before turning back to the stand and surveying the apples laid out there. The price is a little high. Where are these from? The shinobi asked gruffly. The vendor smiled widely. Rain country, the man replied. They're the best in the elemental countries, which is why there's so much. You pay for quality after all. Ibiki grumbled a little bit about overpriced fruit but finally let out a sigh. Paid for half a dozen apples. Once they were tucked away in a bag, the Chunin continued down the street with Naruto trailing along behind him. You shouldn't have bought them, Naruto said suddenly. Ibiki threw another glare over his shoulder. Why the hell not? Because they weren't from Rain Country. Now this caught Ibiki's attention. And his curiosity, if he was being honest with himself. Releasing an inaudible sigh, the tall Chunin turned to Naruto. And how precisely do you know this? He questioned. Naruto grinned broadly. It's all in the eyes and the voice. That man's eyes flickered to the left before he spoke, meaning he was trying to think of something, and his voice changed slightly as he spoke of the apple's origin. If you pay attention to someone's face, it can be easy to tell if they're lying, especially if they are someone as open as that man. Those apples are probably from somewhere around Fire Country, but the vendor is trying to make more money by jacking up the price, claiming that they're from Rain Country. For several long moments Ibiki stared at the academy student before him. I'm going to give you a statement, he finally said. And I want you to tell me whether I'm lying or not. Naruto stared strangely at Ibiki but eventually just shrugged. Sure, whatever. I have an older brother who's a shinobi, Ibiki stated. His face was so blank that it could have been carved from stone, but that didn't stop Naruto from picking up a few hints anyway. Naruto titled his head to the side and studied Ibiki for almost a minute. Finally, a smile broke across his face. You do have a sibling and they are a shinobi, he said, much to Ibiki's surprise. But, I don't think it's an older brother. He paused to stare at the Chunin again. It's a younger brother, isn't it? Ibiki blinked, and then blinked again, and then a third time. Suddenly he threw his head back and began to laugh, causing many people around them to jump in surprise and then hurry away while throwing nervous glances at the man. Damn, kid, Ibiki muttered once he'd calmed down. I never expected that from you. How do you know it was a younger brother? I didn't, Naruto replied with a cheeky grin. It was a guess, one that you just confirmed. Ibiki let out another round of harsh laughter. Where do you learn to read people like that? Poker, poker, poker. It's essential to be able to tell if your opponents are lying. Ibiki said while rubbing his chin thoughtfully. I'd never thought of it that way. Seems like a good way to learn though. Tell ya what, I've got a deal for you. I'll give you a scroll on psychology if you agree to help me out with a few cases. Cases? Naruto asked, instantly perking up. Yep, I'm a part of Leaf Village's intel department. A human lie detector like you could really be of some help. So, you up for it? Hell yeah, Naruto exclaimed, pumping a fist in the air. Ibiki chuckled at the blonde's antics. All right then, he replied. Come by my office tomorrow morning and I'll give you the scroll. Naruto nodded eagerly and then, shouting his thanks, ran off. Ibiki just shook his head in amusement. Almost as soon as Naruto left, Ibiki headed over to the Hokage Tower. He had to wait a half an hour because the Sandaime was in a meeting, but soon enough he was once again standing before the elder shinobi. No trouble, I hope? Sarutobi asked with a raised eyebrow and a small smile. Not at all, Hokage-sama. Ibiki responded smoothly. As a matter of fact I have something to request of you. Today I found out that Naruto-chan is actually quite adept at reading people. He even managed to figure out whether or not I was lying. Sarutobi folded his hands beneath his chin and studied the Chunin before him. Interesting, but what is it that you're requesting? Ibiki's back straightened slightly. I'm interested in possibly putting Naruto's ability to use. Very few shinobi have the ability to read others to such extent, though we all know how much of a disadvantage one could be at against such an opponent. That's a part of the reason why Anbu wear masks, after all. You wanted to use Naruto in interrogations? The Sandaime asked sharply. Not until he's much older, Ibiki answered quickly. For now I want him to train the ability by looking for inconsistencies in profiles, transcripts, and perhaps have him listen to the recordings some light interrogations. Eventually we could bring him in on civilian questionings. At this point his age can only help him because people will underestimate him and thus unwittingly be more open. For a while the Sandaime didn't speak and Ibiki was almost sure that he was going to reject the idea. Thus when a wide smile broke over the Hokage's face and he began to nod, Ibiki was surprised. Yes, Sarutobi mused, sounding quite pleased. I think that that's a very good idea. It will ease Naruto-chan into the shinobi world as well. He won't be so suddenly woken up to the dangers of the world as many children are. LSO. The older man stood suddenly and began walking towards the door. Come with me. I have something I'd like for you to give him. So great was his excitement that Naruto was at the building by the time the sun rose the next morning. He was easily able to navigate through the halls on his own now because he'd been here so many times before, and made it to Ibiki's office in only a couple of minutes. The Chunin was there, bent over some papers on his desk. Ibiki-san, Naruto exclaimed while slamming his hands down on the desk. The older man only grunted and didn't look up from his work. Ibiki, you promised me that scroll. It's on the desk. Naruto blinked in surprise and his eyes quickly caught sight of two medium-sized scrolls lying only inches from his hands. The boy scratched the back of his head sheepishly. Right, but which one's mine? Both of them. Again Naruto found himself surprised. What I mean? Ibiki snorted and finally glanced up at the blonde. Exactly what I said, he replied with a smirk. One of them is the psychology scroll I promised. The other, well, the other is a gift. Naruto stared open-mouthed at the Chunin. A gift? You're giving me a gift? No. Ibiki rolled his eyes. I'm not. And Kami knows I never will. It's from someone else. The young academy student's face scrunched up in confusion. But who? Figure it out on your own. Naruto opened his mouth to retort angrily, only to close it with a huff. He glared at Ibiki, making his displeasure known, but the man only gave him another infuriating smirk. Fine. Naruto finally snapped. His hands reached out and quickly snapped up the scrolls before Ibiki could change his mind and take them back. I will figure it out. With another huff, Naruto left a silently laughing Ibiki in his office. It took Naruto less than half an hour to get back to his home. Once he was in his workroom, his hands hesitated over the two scrolls, unsure as to which he should open first. Finally he shrugged and opened them both at the same time. Just as Ibiki had said, the first scroll was all about psychology. Naruto's eyes scanned over it in interest, but before long curiosity got the better of him and he transferred his attention onto the second scroll. Now this one caught his attention. The second scroll, it turned out, contained a single technique, Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, Shadow Clone Technique. Naruto thought as he read through the rather short scroll, now this could have some good applications. Surprisingly, it took Naruto only a few hours to learn the jutsu. He was only able to make a dozen clones with it before becoming exhausted, but that was more than enough. Naruto knew that the academy taught the Bunshin no Jutsu, clone technique, and now he was already a step ahead in that. Naruto sat back with a smile as he watched the clones move around the room. Another upside was that the clones were great for manual labor. He'd never have to worry about cleaning up his home again. It was too bad that they could be dispelled so easily. No sooner had this thought passed through Naruto's mind than one of the clones who'd been carrying a large stack of scrolls accidentally bumped into a tall bookshelf. A bookshelf whose top shelf contained a pile of kunai. When the clone bumped into the bookshelf, several of these blades toppled from their perch. Most of them landed on the floor with a clatter. But one stabbed straight through the clone's foot. A howl of pain ripped through the room before suddenly being cut off as the clone dispelled. Instantaneously, the real Naruto gasped in shock and pain and grasped at his foot. He hissed through clenched teeth for several moments before abruptly realizing that his foot didn't hurt. Naruto slowly released his foot and stared down at it in surprise and confusion. What had just happened? He could remember being hurt, but now he wasn't. Naruto's eyes widened. He could remember what had happened to the clone as if it had happened to him. This was. Slowly a large, shit-eating grin spread across Naruto's face. This was perfect. With this jutsu he literally had copies of himself. Copies that knew everything that he knew upon their creation. Copies whose knowledge and experiences were instantly relayed to him when they were dispelled. He could study all he wanted, train all he wanted, do whatever he wanted. Of course, the best part of this immediately presented itself in his mind: seal experimentation. By this time Naruto was more than aware of just how dangerous it was to experiment with seals. But if it was a clone that was doing the experimentation, then that didn't matter. If the clone was killed, it wouldn't hurt him. Well, that wasn't entirely accurate. As he'd just painfully discovered, he would remember all of the clones' experiences when they were dispelled. All of them. This meant that if a clone was killed, Naruto would remember dying. He would remember the terror and pain that accompanied those final moments, just as he remembered his clone's shock and fear as it had watched that kunai descend on its foot. The blonde shuddered. That part of the clones really sucked. But it would be worth it nonetheless. He would endure such pain for the bountiful results their use would yield. By the time that Naruto's 8th birthday came and passed, Naruto found himself both more and less busy than usual. He now constantly had several clones in the library, though only at night, of course. He often sent a clone to attend the academy for him, but only they wouldn't be doing anything physical where it could get dispelled, like taijutsu or target practice. One of the upsides to having clones, Naruto had found, was that it gave him time to properly relax when he wanted to. This also led to him hanging around Ibiki even more than usual, but now that he was helping out at the intelligence headquarters, which he'd finally found out was what the Biju building was, the Chunin didn't mind so much. If anything, he was beginning to become eager to help Naruto in honing his skills. The whole situation was quite unnerving to the blonde. On one chilly November afternoon, Naruto was walking home from the intelligence headquarters. Just as he often did, he took a shortcut through a series of back alleys in the red light district. Though many dangerous figures lurked here, the blonde walked without fear. After all, he was personal friends with many of those dangerous figures. It was because of this that Naruto was caught completely by surprise when a pair of rough hands shot out from the mouth of a dark alley and latched onto him, dragging him into the darkness. Despite his shock, the boy immediately began to struggle against his capturer, lashing out with his legs and the one arm that wasn't being held behind his back, even as he desperately tried to reach the kunai in his pockets. Naruto was greeted with a highly satisfying grunt of pain. One of his blows connected with his attacker's chin. The grime-covered, older man took a few stumbling steps backward, but in only a moment was leaping at the blonde again. "Give me your money, kid, and I won't hurt you," the man snarled. In his hand a rusty dagger flashed in the waning twilight. His face set as if carved from stone, Naruto drew a single kunai and began to circle the other man. Despite his shinobi training, the boy knew that the chances weren't good for him. This man was far larger and stronger than him, and doubtless also had countless years of experience in scuffles such as these. He needed to get out of there and fast, but the man was between him and the exit. Finally Naruto made a lunge to get around the man. He was instantly blocked and their blades met with the screech that only metal could make. From that close range the man lashed out with his fist, and Naruto quickly parried and replied in kind. The next few seconds, though they seemed more like hours, were a blur of motion in Naruto's mind. All he could remember was fighting tooth and nail against his attacker and for the first time truly fearing for his life. He'd only ever fought against kids a few years older than him and was unprepared for just how outmatched he was when pitted against someone so much stronger. His shinobi training counted for nothing in this kind of a situation. How exactly the fight ended, Naruto would never be sure. All he knew was that one moment he'd been fighting with the man and the next the two of them were on the ground still struggling. It took several moments for the blonde to realize, however, that it was only he who was still struggling, while the other man lay suspiciously still. Slowly, fearfully, Naruto stilled his movements. When the man's face-down position still didn't change, he let out a shaky breath and began the process of extracting himself from beneath the much heavier man. When he'd finally done so he sat, panting, while still staring at his attacker. In a series of jerky movements Naruto crawled over to the motionless man. He paused only for a moment as his hands rested on the man's side before he rolled him onto his back in a single motion. Naruto stared, his face completely free from expression as his mind grinded to a halt. His kunai was buried up to the hilt in the man's chest, right where his heart would be. Crimson red. Blood was already staining the man's shirt around the blade and even as he stared was beginning to pool on the ground beneath him. His mind still blank, Naruto's eyes slowly trailed from the man to his own hands. In a disturbing contradiction, his left hand was pristine and pale while his right was covered in thick, crimson red, blood. It dripped down his arm, staining his clothes a dark shade, Naruto knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that none of it belonged to him. This shock seemed to jumpstart Naruto's brain. As if to make up for lost time, it instantaneously began racing and thoughts flew through his mind so quickly he was barely able to catch on to them. Naruto quickly scrambled away from the man from the man's corpse mumbling, "No, no, no," over and over again under his breath. He hadn't meant to kill him. He'd only been trying to get away. They'd been struggling, yes, and the man had been attempting to subdue him, but he hadn't actually meant to kill. Naruto's thoughts broke up as bile rose in throat. The blonde scrambled onto his hands and knees and screwed his eyes closed as his stomach heaved. Kami, he could smell the blood. It seemed to be chalking up the alley. And the taste, he could taste copper in his mouth. His stomach heaved once more, knowing exactly what it was. It was another 10 minutes before a small, trembling blonde would stagger out from within the dark alley. His clothes stained with blood. Naruto followed his instincts and began to run blindly through the streets, intent on one location. Once he arrived there, in front of a dingy, crumbling apartment building, he immediately began to pound on the door. "Tasuki, Tasuki." A moment later the door was yanked open and a bleary looking Tasuki stood in the doorway. "Naruto-kun," he yawned. "What are ya doin', Naruto didn't reply but instead practically threw himself at Tasuki, babbling incessantly. The older man stared down at him in shock even as the force of the boy pushed him to the ground. Naruto, he grunted in surprise. His arms automatically wrapped around the blonde and attempted to pull up. Tasuki could only catch pieces of what Naruto was sobbing. I didn't mean to, he was repeating over and over. I swear I didn't. Naruto. Tasuki called again. Naruto-kun, calm down. Please. It took another few minutes but finally the child wore himself out. He lay against Tasuki, breathing harshly while the scarred man pushed them up into a sitting position. Tasuki released a somewhat relieved sigh. Alright, now what is this about, Naruto-kun? What isn't her fault? Naruto's eyes shot open in shock, as if he hadn't realized exactly what he'd been saying. Instantly the boy was up and scrambling away from Tasuki, who was left blinking in surprise. Naruto's head whipped around, looking for an exit. And nothing. He stammered. Nothing. Everything's fine. Tasuki gave the 8-year-old a flat stare. Bullshit. This ain't nothing. Now tell me, what happened? Naruto's mouth opened and closed several times. It was clear to Tasuki that the boy was still looking for a way out of this, so he leveled a glare at the boy. Naruto. Alright, the blonde finally exclaimed. He hung his head down and gulped. His eyes flickered to the door a few times, as if debating whether or not he could make a break for it without Tasuki catching him, but finally he too. Okay, a few deep breaths and looked back up. Something did happen. It started when I was walking home from my last meeting with Ibiki. Tasuki listened intently while Naruto spoke, never erupting to ask questions even though he looked as though he desperately wanted to at some points. Finally, once Naruto had finished telling his tale, he let out a heavy sigh. His eyes were dark and sad, but Naruto could glean no more about his emotions other than that from his face. Suddenly Naruto felt himself beginning to worry. Had he done the right thing in telling Tasuki? Was the man disappointed in him? Or angry? Was he going to scream that he was a murderer and drag him to the police? Was he? Naruto-kun, Tasuki said softly, breaking into the boy's thoughts. Naruto's head snapped upwards, staring at him with wide, fearful eyes. Tasuki repressed a groan. He was not good at these sorts of things. Naruto-kun, the dark-haired man repeated. It's all right. With those words all of the tension seemed to drain from the blonde. He sucked in several shuddering breaths and wrapped his arms around himself, suddenly feeling very cold and very warm at the same time. But Tassa. He sighed once more and stared at a point off to the side. Life, he began slowly, can be difficult. Throughout life ya will be forced to make decisions that y'd rather not. But you will have to make these choices whether ya like it or not. Tasuki let out a bitter snort. In a way, that's all that life is, choices. Ever connecting, ever changing choices. What ya must remember, however, that ya will never avenue complete control over life. Even if ya always make da right choices, other people may make different ones, and these choices will avenue an effect upon ya. All ya can do is adapt ta da moment and live life da best way ya know. Dat man, he made da choice ta attempt ta mug ya. Dat is choice. Choice, upon being faced with such a situation, was ta fight back. Now tell me, had ya not fought back, what do ya think would avenue happened? Ya would not avenue lived, I can assure ya. Men such as dat rarely allow their victims ta live ta tell their tale. Ya knew dis, if unconsciously, and made da split-second decision ta fight for life. It cost dat other man is life, yes, but ya managed ta survive in da end. Is a choice such as dis really a bad thing? Out of da two ya, isn't it best fair ya ta survive while a man like him dies? Naruto didn't have an answer for him. Before anyone comments on the whole Madara telling Naruto about the Akatsuki thing. Yes, I do believe that that's a realistic situation. The way I see it, Madara is an incredibly strong shinobi who, even if he lost to him, was on par with the Shodaime Hokage and who just got back from killing off one of Konoha's strongest clans. He knows he's powerful and believes that he'll be able to get the Kyuubi no matter what, so he figures that telling Naruto about it will spice up the situation a bit. He correctly reckons that telling Naruto will cause the boy to train himself, which in the end will present Madara with more of a challenge. Basically he's bored and self-assured. S.R. Arc I. Chapter 5. The Vacation. Title: Failing Twilight Author. Shadow Rebirth Beta Reader. Rukia 23 Rating. T. Warnings: death, blood and gore, coarse language, adult themes, spoilers. Chapter WC 5649. Story WC 25786. First written June 28, 2008. Last edited February 21, 2009. Posted October 27, 2008. Summary: Naruto had learnt from a young age that life could get hectic, but all this chaos with Biju, daimyos, and psychotic missing nin was going a bit too far. Now just throw in a fourth great shinobi war and you've got one pissed off seal master. Oh story, no pairings. Failing Twilight Chapter 5, The Vacation. It could easily be said that Naruto was never the same after his first kill. Whether this was a good or a bad thing, however, could be debated. Either way, in the following week he was quiet and withdrawn and could often be found simply contemplating. Because of this, when a chance to take a break from his current life came, he eagerly took it. Wave Country? Naruto asked Haru curiously. The graying barkeeper nodded and chuckled. Yeah, but I won't be there for long. I'll be back within 2 weeks. Who's going to look after the Black Wolf Tavern while you're gone though? And why are you going anyway? There have been problems in Wave Country recently, Haru admitted. Apparently some big shot company is destroying the economy there so that they can take over. The thing is, I have contracts to get my fish from there, and if this company is messing with the economy, then it might interrupt my shipment. So I'm heading up there to personally escort the shipment back. It'll give me some kind of idea of just how bad things are gonna get. My cousin agreed to look after the tavern while I'm gone. Like I said, I won't be long. Naruto stared past Haru with wide, thoughtful eyes. Wave Country. It was outside of the Leaf Village, outside of Fire Country. An entirely different country. Naruto murmured something so quietly that Haru, standing barely a foot away, was unable to hear it. Sorry, he questioned. What was that? The blonde nervously cleared his throat and refused to meet Haru's eyes. I said, can I come? Haru blinked in surprise. Come to Wave Country with me, you mean? He replied. Naruto stared up at him with wide, pleading eyes. And it only took a few more seconds before his defenses crumbled. Fine, he sighed. I suppose it'll be okay. You're going to have to get permits to leave the village though. That's no problem, Naruto said while smiling brightly. He turned on his heel and began to run out of the tavern. I'll go pack right now. Don't forget, we're leaving Wednesday morning, Haru called after him. The blonde shouted some unintelligible reply and soon was out of sight, leaving Haru shaking his head and chuckling. Indeed, Naruto did have a way to get the permits that he needed. Or rather, he had a person. And that night he confronted that person with a wide smile on his face and a twinkle in his eye. Ibiki, Naruto called in a sing-song voice as he peeked his head in the man's office. Ibiki grunted without looking up from his work. Yeah, what I need, kid? Oh, nothing much, Naruto replied as he slipped into the small room. He lightly crossed the floor and then stopped in front of the Chunin's desk, his arms crossed before him. For whatever the reason, those words seemed to strike a chord in Ibiki. He immediately glanced up. His mouth drawn in a tight line. Nothing, really. Then, pray tell, what is this? Nothing. Naruto's grin widened. Just some permits to leave the village. Ya know, basic stuff. Ibiki cocked an eyebrow. Permits? Why the hell are you leaving the village? It's only short term, Naruto quickly told him. I'm just going to Wave Country for a couple of weeks with a merchant train. It's like a vacation or something. Ibiki rolled his eyes, but finally sighed in defeat when Naruto began to stare pitifully at him. Fine, I'll get you the damn permits, he said. But, a fairly disturbing, dark smile crossed his face. You're going to have to do something for me. Now it was Naruto's turn to be wary. The blonde eyed Ibiki for a moment, not sure whether or no It'd be a good idea to proceed when the man had a grin like that on his face. Finally, however, his curiosity won out. Yes, you're going to handle my paperwork for a month when you come back. And properly, mind you. Naruto groaned. Ibiki, that's not fair. It damn well is. You and I both know perfectly well that it's illegal for me to give you those permits without you going through the proper channels, which would take months. And since you don't have any guardians, you'd most likely be denied. Hell, because of that I'm going to have to get you fake permits, which are beyond illegal for a civilian to hold. But you'll get them, right? If I agree, Naruto said grudgingly. Ibiki smirked. Yes, if you agree. Naruto hesitated, gnawing on his lower lip, but they both knew what his answer would be. Come Wednesday morning, Naruto was completely ready to leave, fake permits and all. Of course, since the permits were fake, they required him to wear a henge while leaving, in order to match his appearance with that on his new ID card. A dark-haired Naruto walked nervously alongside Haru as they approached the gates to the Leaf Village. Half of this nervousness was from fear he'd be found out by the Chunin guards stationed there, but the other half was from the anticipation of finally getting to see what was outside the village. ID and permits, one of the Chunin, a man in his late 20s, grunted out. He walked down the line of the merchant train, which consisted of 3 wagons filled with merchandise and at least 20 civilian men and 4 samurai guards, scanning the IDs as he went. He barely glanced over Haru and Naruto's before continuing on. Once he was out of sight, Naruto let out an inaudible sigh of relief. All right, a second guard called out. All clear. At this signal the merchant train jerked to a start as the oxen team pulling it began to walk. Naruto's previous fear evaporated into the cool morning air as he began to jump up and down in excitement. Beside him, Haru chuckled in amusement. Before very long the merchant train left Konoha far behind. Naruto craned his neck back, watching as the tall gates of the village's walls disappeared from view. Don't worry, Haru murmured to the boy. We'll be back soon enough. The young boy scowled. I'm not worried, he replied loudly. I've just never seen the village from the outside before. Haru chuckled while glancing at Naruto knowingly. The blonde's scowl deepened in annoyance. Naruto spent most of the morning running back and forth along the merchant train, all the while chatting excitedly with different people. The 4 samurai in particular. He begged for them to show him their swords until they finally did. Though they were annoyed, they couldn't help but also be amused. As the child let out gasps of amazement. Before long, however, Naruto was naturally worn out. He may have been training as a shinobi for several years, but he was still only 8 years old and wasn't used to walking for hours on end. Upon noticing his charge's fatigue, Haru lifted the protesting boy up so that he could sit on the end of one of the wagons. I'm fine, Naruto hollered while attempting to leap back to the ground. No, Haru said firmly, pushing the boy back down. Save your strength for now. We're going to be on the road for several days. Of course Naruto pouted and refused to speak to Haru for the next half hour. But he relented nonetheless, knowing the wisdom of the barkeeper's words. The next 2 days passed in a blur of excitement for Naruto. They spent the night sleeping outdoors, which was a first for Naruto. He had an incredibly fun time listening to the men as they swapped stories around a large bonfire that was set up. Most of those stories weren't really suitable for a kid's ears. But Naruto was more than used to it due to his upbringing and time spent in the Black Wolf Tavern. By noon around the 3rd day Naruto noticed that the air was beginning to feel heavier. As if it was weighed down by something. There was also a strange smell in the air, almost like salt. Naruto's nose wrinkled in confusion. Is something wrong, Yurei-kun? One of the samurai asked. Yurei was the name that was on Naruto's ID and permits, and thus the name that he had to go by. It had been difficult to remember to answer to it at first, but Haru had helped him to get used to it. The blonde was sure that the name was Ibiki's vindictive side shining through. Yurei meant ghost, and since Yurei technically didn't exist, he was like a ghost. Naruto would be pissed at the Chunin if anyone realized this and figured out the ID was fake. Naruto spared the samurai, a man in his mid-20s with long black hair and shocking purple eyes, a glance. Not really, Ryoga-san, he replied. His eyes scanned the thick foliage that lined the dirt road as if expecting to find an answer there. I just feel weird. Like the air is heavier or something. Ryoga instantly began laughing. That's because it is, he told the young blonde with humor clear in his eyes. It's heavy with water. We're approaching the sea, which means it's getting more humid. The swordsman blinked, as if suddenly remembering something. Ah, that's right. You said you've never been out of Konoha before, nay. So that must mean that you've never seen the ocean before. Well then, you're in for a treat. We're near the coast right now and, if I remember this road correctly, there's a bend coming up that gives a fantastic view of the ocean. Naruto's eyes widened in surprise. The ocean. That's right. Wave Country was apparently an island, which meant that they had to cross the ocean to get to it. The blue-eyed boy exuberantly dashed forward towards the front of the caravan, leaving Ryoga chuckling in his wake. True to the samurai's word, after only a minute there was a break in the tree line on the right side of the merchant train, which revealed that the road wound its way along the edge of a cliff looking over the ocean. Far off ahead a long beach was visible, along with a large town and a port. As soon as Naruto caught sight of this view he froze in place, staring with wide eyes at the ocean. The merchant train continued to move on past him, but he barely even noticed as his eyes watched the waves crashing against the coast and the sun reflecting off water. Several shades darker than his eyes. Beautiful, a voice behind Naruto spoke up. So caught up was the boy that he didn't even jump in surprise at being caught unaware. Instead he just nodded dumbly, never taking his eyes off the water. Behind him Haru chuckled. Come on, kid, he said while firmly grasping Naruto's shoulder. We wouldn't want you to get left behind. And don't worry, we'll be traveling along the coast for hours yet. So you'll still get to see the ocean. Naruto nodded, but it still took him another few seconds to tear his gaze away from the view before him. Even as he followed the barkeeper back to the wagons he continued to throw glances over his shoulder. The merchant train arrived at the port town that had been visible from the cliff just before nightfall. They'd be spending the night there, Naruto was told, and then would be leaving early in the morning by boat to reach the wave. The rest of the merchants and I are going to be spending the night in a hotel, Haru said to Naruto. Will you be joining us, or? Naruto glanced back at where the laborers and the samurai guards were mingling around the wagons, which had been stopped on the edge of the town. He contemplated his answer, for only a bare second before throwing a grin to Haru. Nope, he replied and then waved back to the man while trotting over to the large group of men. I'll see you in the morning. Sleeping outside, under the stars, was much more fun to the blonde. And besides, he wanted to see if he could get Ryoga to tell him any more stories of his time in Bird Country, where he'd partaken in a small war between nobles. Hey, Yurei-kun, one of the samurai called out with a grin as he noticed Naruto's approach. How'd y'all like some sake? Naruto stared with wide eyes at the water splashing violently against the side of the boat as it passed beneath them. Currently, the boy was standing on the deck of a large ship, leaning as far over the metal railings of the ship as he dared. Said ship was bigger than anything Naruto had ever seen before, big enough to hold several hundred people and half as many animals at one time. Only once he got bored of staring down at the water did Naruto turn back around to face the deck. There were people crawling all over, making it seem like an anthill that was thriving with activity. Most of these people were laborers, deckhands, but a few were passengers like him. Naruto noticed more than just a few samurai were walking around as well, keeping the peace and guarding the wares on board. The blonde-haired boy had spent most of that morning exploring the ship. He'd made his way into almost every tucked-away corner that he could, until finally someone got sick of his snooping and sent him above deck. Naruto didn't mind, of course, since watching the ocean as they sailed by was just as fun. Ah, so this is where you've been, Yurei-kun, Ryoga commented as he strode up to Naruto. His long hair, which was held up in a ponytail as always, whipped violently in the wind. If there was one thing that Naruto didn't like much about being on deck, it was that it was incredibly windy, to the point that he almost needed to squint. Enjoying the view, Naruto nodded enthusiastically. This is great, he hollered. I've never been on a boat before. Ryoga smiled amusedly. I'm surprised you're not getting seasick. Most people do their first time sailing. I never get sick, Naruto replied with a shrug. Never. Naruto nodded in confirmation. He opened his mouth to say more, only to shut it abruptly and swallow harshly. The reason he didn't get sick was because of the Kyuubi. But there was no way that he was going to tell Ryoga anything about that. He was probably one of the few adults who didn't know what Naruto was, and the blonde wanted to keep it that way. Suddenly Ryoga's eyes slid past Naruto to stare at something in the distance. Ah, it looks like we'll be arriving soon anyway. Naruto spun around and immediately saw what Ryoga had. There was land peeking over the horizon. Wave country. Naruto energetically launched himself at the bars of the ship's railings once more, prepared to stare at the smudge of green on the horizon until it enlarged into an island. And indeed Naruto did watch, enraptured, as the island came in view. Before long he could see that they were approaching another port town, where several ships were already docked. Bouncing on his heels, Naruto waited for over an hour as the ship docked and was unloaded. Finally, he followed Haru and the other merchants off the ship and into a bustling town. Haru led A for on. Silent Naruto. He was too busy twisting his head this way and that, looking at anything and everything, to talk through the streets and into a rather large tavern. The inside of the building kind of reminded Naruto of the Black Wolf Tavern, except it was brighter, much less smoky, and smelt strongly of fish. Haru strode up to the bartender of the tavern and shook hands strongly with him. "Ah, Fujiko," he exclaimed. "It's good to see you again. How's business been?" "Good, for the most part." "Likewise, I assume." "Of course." "Well, dismissing the seasonal ups and downs, of course." The other man, Fujiko, looked down at Naruto as the boy stared around the tavern with unabashed curiosity. "And who's this?" he asked. Haru grinned and laid a hand on Naruto's shoulder, bringing the boy's attention back to the two men. "This is Yurei," Haru introduced. "He came along because he wanted to see the world outside Konoha." "Yurei-kun, this is Ekezan Fujiko, an old associate of mine." "Nice to meet you, old man," Naruto said loudly. Fujiko laughed aloud at the boy's blatant rudeness. "It's nice to meet you too, Yurei-kun," he chuckled. "You can explore a bit while I take care of things here, if you like," Haru told the blonde. "Just stay out of trouble and be sure to make it back to the hotel we're staying at by nightfall." Naruto nodded distractedly before turning around and heading back towards the tavern's door. Unfortunately, he only just made it there when he suddenly collided with an older man. A drunk, older man. "Oi, brat," the man slurred. "What I think doin'? Watch where going, will ya?" Naruto scowled in annoyance. "You bumped into me," he snapped. "You should watch where you're going." The older man glared down at the brat before him. He opened his mouth to retort, but then abruptly closed it while blinking in surprise. His eyes drooped and then all of a sudden he dropped to the floor like a stone, snoring loudly. A man sitting at a nearby table snorted in annoyance at the sight. "Damn, Chizuna passed out again," he growled. He paused for a moment to eye Naruto. "Hey kid," he said while pulling out a coin. "If you take Chizuna back to his house, I'll give you this." Naruto rolled his eyes. What did the man think his was? Free. That coin wasn't even enough to buy a single bowl of ramen. Still, Naruto couldn't help but feel slightly guilty at the thought of just leaving the older man where he was, no matter how much he deserved it, so he sighed and accepted the coin. "Fine. Where does he live?" It took Naruto almost an hour to get to where Chizuna, the old man, lived. Fortunately the man woke up even before they left the tavern, so he'd only had to half-drag the man there. Considering as Chizuna was more than twice his size though, this really was a feat. Chizuna's house, as it turned out, was right on the water. Literally. Like many of the houses in the area, it was over a dock with the water rushing beneath it. A large windmill, or watermill, technically, was situated directly behind it. Naruto grunted from Chizuna's weight as he knocked solidly on the door of the two-story home. Fortunately only moments later it was opened by a dark-haired woman who looked to be around 25. She took one look at the scene before her and instantly began scolding the half-conscious Chizuna. "Father," she exclaimed loudly, "you're drunk again. I thought I told you to stop wasting all of your money at that bar. You should have learned last time when Nanjiro-san had to carry you home." Suddenly the woman's attention shifted onto Naruto. "Oh you poor dear, I'm so sorry about my father. Please, come in. Naruto hesitated, glancing at Tazuna. Tazuna's daughter seemed to immediately understand what he was asking. She scowled again at her father, who was emitting snores once more. Just leave him there. He deserves it. The blonde shrugged and then gracelessly dropped the drunken older man onto the ground before following the woman into the wooden home. Have a seat, the woman said while gesturing to the chairs in the living room. Would you like some tea? Yes please. Oh, how rude of me. The woman exclaimed. I am Tsunami, Tazuna's daughter. It's a pleasure to meet you, Tsunami-san, Naruto replied politely. I'm Nanashi Yurei. Tsunami nodded pleasantly, apparently completely missing his stumble. Nanashi wasn't actually the surname on his ID, but it had been the first thing that he could think of to cover up his blunder. Perhaps he could ask Ibiki to change it to that when they got back though. He liked the sound of it. No name ghost. Well, thank you so much for bringing my father home, Yurei-kun, Tsunami continued. I'll be right back with that tea. Tsunami had only just stepped into the kitchen when the front door opened. It wasn't Tazuna who stepped inside however. He was still snoring on the ground just outside, but instead a tan man in his late 20s with a cross-like scar on his chin and a 5-year-old boy. Both were laughing loudly and had fishing poles strung over their shoulders. Tsunami paused in the doorway between the living room and the kitchen and positively beamed at the two. Kaiza-kun, Inari-chan, she greeted. You're home just in time. We've got a guest. With that she ducked back into the kitchen, intent on getting tea for everyone. Kaiza blinked, in surprise at the young blonde sitting in his living room, but was quick to smile broadly at the boy. Why hello, I'm Kaiza, he said. Inari just stared curiously at the boy, quiet until the older man nudged his shoulder. Be polite, Inari-chan. Inari smiled shyly at Naruto, revealing one missing front tooth. Hello, he greeted. Naruto grinned at both of them. Nice to meet ya, he said. I'm Nanashi Yurei. I brought Tazuna-san home from the tavern in town. Kaiza raised an eyebrow. The tavern? What were you doing there? I'm visiting Wave from Fire Country with a friend of mine. He's here to escort a shipment for his bar or something, I'm not really sure. He's friends with the owner of the tavern. I just tagged along on the trip. Fire Country? Kaiza asked, looking intrigued. Where about in Fire Country? Naruto grinned again. Kanahagakure no Sato, he replied. I've lived there my whole life. This is my first time getting out. Naruto ended up spending the entire afternoon with Tazuna's family, and the old man himself, once he woke up. They drifted from topic to topic, but somehow the conversation seemed to come easily. Gato, Naruto questioned at one point. I've heard of him. Haru mentioned that he was causing some major problems with the economy. Kaiza nodded solemnly. He has been. He's been attempting to bully the people of Wave into submitting to his rule, if you will. We've been resisting, of course, but, Kaiza trailed off while briefly glancing at this adopted son. It was clear to Naruto that he didn't want the boy to know just how bad the situation really was. Naruto leaned back in his seat, a thoughtful expression on his face. How come he'd never heard of Wave's situation in Konoha? Well, Haru had, but Haru knew about everything going on in the elemental countries because of all the travelers passing through his tavern. The blonde glanced out the window suddenly and noticed that the sun was just beginning to dip down on the horizon. Sorry, Kaiza-san, Tsunami-san. But I really should get back to the hotel now, he apologized. Tsunami gasped in surprise when she saw what time it was. Instantly she leapt up. Oh, of course, she exclaimed. And I really need to get started on dinner as well. Are you sure you wouldn't like to stay to eat, Yurei-kun? Thank you, but I promised Haru-san that I'd be back by dark and it'll take me a while to walk to the hotel. You'll come back tomorrow though, right? Inari asked. Naruto chuckled while scratching the back of his neck. Sure, Inari-chan, he replied. He glanced up at Kaiza and Tsunami. That is, if it's all right with you. Kaiza and Tsunami smiled widely. Of course, Tsunami said instantly. Please drop by tomorrow for lunch. And perhaps bring this friend of yours if you can. Naruto agreed immediately. He had a feeling that Haru would like this family. The young blonde waved goodbye and then began to make his way back into the village proper. Naruto spent most of his week-long stay in Wave with Kaiza, Tsunami, Inari, and Tazuna. He got along well with the family very well, and he knew that he was going to miss them terribly when he had to return to Konoha. The day before Naruto was set to leave, he walked to Tazuna's house with a somewhat downtrodden mood. He wasn't sure why, but the air around him seemed even heavier than usual, as if signifying what was to come. The second that Naruto stopped in front of Tazuna's house, he knew that something was wrong. When no one answered his knocks, his worry grew to outright fear. Tsunami's show. I'd be home at the very least, and usually Tazuna didn't leave to go out drinking until later. Naruto turned on his heel and began to head back into the port town. His pace grew with every step he took until he was outright running. Something was terribly wrong, he just knew it. The boy's fear was partially confirmed when he reached the town. No one was there. It appeared as though it had been entirely abandoned in the time it took him to walk to Tazuna's and come back. Naruto began to frantically search all around for any signs of life. Eventually, Naruto noticed that there were many tracks leading down a path further into the island. Without hesitation he followed this lead, and before long he spotted people up ahead. They were all gathered around a tall chain-link fence that surrounded a complex. Naruto shouldered his way through the crowd until he could actually see what was going on. In front of the crowd was a rather large building complex that was surrounded by a 15-foot-tall chain-link fence. Numerous armed guards, mercenaries, it looked like, filled the outer courtyard. What held the crowd's attention, however, was a small, older man who was standing next to a wooden post. And bound to that post was a chillingly familiar figure. Kaiza. No! A young voice screamed from off to the side. Father! Eyes wide, Naruto's head whipped around to stare as a struggling, tearful, and enraged Inari was held back by Tazuna. The elder man looked just as torn as the boy, and a sobbing Tsunami clutched onto his shirt with a vice-like grip. Naruto's heart almost broke at the sight of the family. But the short man didn't seem to be affected at all. Instead he just laughed and then began some speech about how he'd kill anyone who stood up to him, starting with Kaiza. For his part, Naruto almost began to see red as the diminutive man spoke. How dare he? The blonde seethed in his mind. He had no right. When the man raised one hand to signal the men on either side of him, Naruto's rage finally snapped. In an instant Naruto created half a dozen shadow clones. Under the crowd's stunned gazes he and the clones launched themselves over the chain-link fence. In midair Naruto flicked his wrist, sending a handful of shurikens slicing through the air. A second later Kaiza's bonds smoothly fell away, freeing him. Naruto had two of his clones grab Kaiza and get out of the courtyard. While the other four each took a specially made seal that he'd been developing for a while. They dashed to each of the four corners of the courtyard, dodging panicking samurai as they went. Simultaneously they slapped the slips of paper on the walls and then poofed out of existence with wide smirks covering their faces. In the center of the courtyard that same smirk stretched across the face of the original Naruto. It was too bad that clones had no chakra and thus couldn't activate seals, but that didn't matter when one was using a chain seal. Once he activated the master seal in his hand, his chakra would be drawn to the other seals like a magnet, activating them as well. All he had to do was get out of the blast area and he'd be home free. In the fraction of a second Naruto's eyes met Gato's, or at least that's who he assumed the man was, from Kaiza's stories. The older man looked like he was torn between being terrified and downright furious. His eyes were bulging out of his skew. And his face had turned a strange molted color. For a moment Naruto was sure that Gato was going to jump him himself, but then the blonde activated the seal in his hands, dropped it, and turned and ran like hell. Behind him, the world exploded. The second Naruto landed near the group of villagers, he was enveloped by a weeping Tsunami. Thank you, she sobbed. Thank you. Naruto stumbled under the woman's weight and only just managed to catch himself. He awkwardly patted her arm, unsure how to reply. At the same time his eyes met with Kaiza's. He didn't say anything, but he didn't need to. His expression said it all. How do you do that? Inari's odd voice asked from beside him. Naruto followed his gaze and saw that his handiwork had turned out just as he'd hoped. The entire incident Of the courtyard was covered in smoke and flames, and only the courtyard. Basically a supped-up explosion tag, Naruto replied smugly, but it was linked to a series of containment seals, to stop any collateral damage or casualties. Upon seeing Inari's confused expression, he elaborated, containment seals cause a barrier of wind to form around the area. It's only for a few quick seconds but it's enough to contain the blast. The seals then burn themselves up, leaving no trace of their existence behind. Inari blinked slowly as this explanation sunk in. When he finally tore his gaze away owned the flames so that he could face Naruto, his expression was filled with awe. That was awesome, Yurei. Naruto and Haru spent the rest of the evening at Tizuna's house. Inari was bouncing all over the place, excited from the day's action. He'd taken to trailing along after Naruto, declaring that he'd become a ninja so that he'd be just like Naruto. Both Tizuna and Tsunami were pretty quiet, hackened by just how closely to death Kaiza had come, but Kaiza himself didn't seem too bothered. He actually was more determined than ever to help the village, even though Gato was now gone. Haru just sat back and watched from a distance, both proud with what Naruto had done and amused by all the attention the boy was getting. Apparently, the whole town considered him to be a hero. The shipping economy is going to be up in the air for a while, but now that Gato is finally gone it should have a chance to stabilize, Haru commented. Without fear, waves should prosper, Kaiza agreed. It'll take a while, but we will strengthen our village again, no matter the cost. Haru glanced over at Naruto and chuckled when he saw that the boy was passed out on the couch. Still young despite his experience, I guess. He'll be one hell of a shinobi one day, Kaiza murmured. He's already well on his way. Are you his uncle? Nope. No relation, Haru replied. Yurei is an orphan who lives in the area near where my bar is. So he's taken to hanging around. He's never been out of Konohagakure before, so when he heard that I was taking the rip, he jumped on the chance to come. I'm still not quite sure how he managed to get a legal traveling pass, but that's one of the things that I just don't ask. You're close to him though. Haru snorted. He seems to draw in anyone who gets close to him. That boy's different, in more ways than you could imagine. He needs people on his side and I'll gladly help him out. What can a civilian do to help a shinobi? Kaiza asked teasingly. Haru's lips stretched to form a wide grin. Quite a bit, actually. Fighting-wise I may not be much help, but when it comes to information I've got everything. More information passes through bars than most people would. Guess, and when you've been around for as long as I have, you invariably build up some contacts. I'll be able to help Yurei-kun form his own information network. Kaiza's grin matched Haru's. Well then, I'll be glad to help out all that I can. Whimpers of pain and rage came from a small man wrapped in bandages. A doctor flitted around him, changing the bandages. As he did so, severe burns could be seen all over the short man's skin. Almost done, sir, the doctor said in a placating tone. You're lucky just to be alive, honestly. We'll have to take you to Mist Village to have some special surgeries done though. Gato snarled wordlessly. Just work quickly, he snapped, and call ahead to the hospital. I want to be back here as soon as I can. But sir, your wounds will take quite some time to heal, even with the help of a skilled medic nin. The doctor protested. Before he could continue, he quelled under Gato's harsh glare and silently turned back to his work. In the silence, Gato turned his glare onto his burnt hands. I will kill this Nanashi Yurei, if it's the last thing I ever do. Honestly, it's always hit me as a little strange that the manga, anime, or any fanfiction that I've ever read, for that matter, never commented on how the wave mission was Naruto's first time seeing the ocean. I mean, he said that that was his first time out of Konoha, right? And Konoha's nowhere near the coast, so it must have been his first time. And I'm sure that nearly everyone who doesn't live near a coast can remember their first time seeing the ocean. I certainly can. I should also mention that I know that Team 7 apparently only takes a day to get to Wave from Konoha in the canon, but keep in mind that wagons move much slower, hence the 3-day trip here. I want to point out that I do not support underage drinking, which is mentioned in this chapter and will be mentioned again several times in the story. Honestly, I don't like alcohol much at all. I've seen what it can do to people. I have a godfather who died at the age of 45 from sclerosis of the liver. He left behind 2 children, the oldest of whom was only 13. Regardless of this though, it's a part of Naruto's world and realistically is something that he'd get into, considering his upbringing. Arc I. Chapter 6. The Game. Title. Failing Twilight Author. Shadow Rebirth Beta Reader. Rukia 23 Rating. T. Warnings. Death. Blood and gore. Coarse language. Adult themes. Spoilers. Chapter WC. 7,308 Total WC. 33,094. First written. October 2, 2008. Last edited. February 21, 2009. Posted. December 13, 2008. Summary. Naruto had learnt from a young age that life could get hectic, but all this chaos with Biju, daimyos, and psychotic missing nin was going a bit too far. Now just thr. Out in a 4th grade shinobi war and you've got one pissed off seal master. Oh story. No pairings. Failing Twilight Chapter 6. The Game. Despite the fun he'd had, Naruto felt a wave of relief wash over him as he re-entered Konoha. He was literally bouncing in his seat on the back of a merchant wagon while gazing around at the buildings with a new sense of appreciation. Haru just chuckled and ruffled his hair a bit. After leaving Wave, with a great send-off from the townspeople there, the merchant wagon had taken a short detour through Fire Country to stop at a few towns. The samurai that Naruto had hung out with left them in Hajime, a rather large city in the northern part of the country, with promises to keep in contact. They'd also made Naruto swear that he would spar with them when he was older. Along the way, Haru introduced him to all of the various people that he knew. Some of them were merchants and some were craftsmen, but most were the owners of other inns and taverns. Naruto was shocked by just how many people knew Haru and would happily welcome him into their homes. Surprisingly, Haru continued to refer to Naruto as Nanashi Yurei. The blonde child figured that the name had just stuck. He didn't mind at all and eventually decided to ask Ibiki to change the name on his travel pass to that when he saw the Chunin again. Now that he was back in Konoha however, Naruto was eager to get back into the swing of things. He was missing his friends and he had some new ideas for some seals that he wanted to try out. So are you going to head straight home? Haru asked. Naruto opened his mouth to reply, only to cut himself off with a groan. I've got to go see Ibiki, he said. I promised him that I would as soon as I got back. He was almost tempted to try to skip out on the month of paperwork that he'd promised to do, but Ibiki probably already knew that he was back, being a part of the intel department and all. Indeed, as soon as Naruto reached Ibiki's office that day, he felt a wave of dread wash over him. He hesitantly reached for the door handle, but before he could even touch it the door suddenly swung open. Standing in the doorway, looming over him, was Ibiki. The Chunin had an evil smile on his face, one that spoke of impending doom. Naruto gulped and leaned around Ibiki to catch sight of his desk. The dread within him welled up once more when he saw that it was covered in stacks of paper. The door slammed shut behind him with all of the finality of a jail cell door. The Konohagakure Park Reserve was the largest forested area available to civilians inside of the village's walls. It covered about 1 square mile of land that was crisscrossed by pathways leading to numerous picnic tables, ice cream stands, and playground. There was a lake in the middle of the reserve that had several small streams leading away from it. As the bright spring sun beat down on the citizens of Konoha, Naruto could be seen running along a sidewalk atop a hill in the reserve. His feet slapped loudly against the concrete, but the sound was mostly drowned out by the splashing of the lake that the sidewalk ran alongside. It had been 1 week since Naruto had returned from his trip out of Konoha. 1 week since Naruto had begun to do Ibiki's paperwork in order to fulfill his promise. 1 week into his month of hell. Fortunately, Ibiki was not entirely without mercy towards the young boy. Since he had diligently done his work for a week, the Chunin was allowing Naruto to have single day off for rest and relaxation. Naruto was determined to spend it well and as such was hurrying towards a special hidden spot that he knew of. Despite his eagerness, Naruto's footsteps slowed as he caught sight of a black-haired boy sitting on a wooden dock that thrust out into the lake. He knew that the boy was in his class, but for the life of him couldn't remember his name. As if sensing eyes on him, the boy suddenly glanced over his shoulder. The moment their eyes met, Naruto felt a cold chill settle into his bones. Uchiha Sasuke, he remembered dully. He could already see those spinning red eyes forming out of the boy's black depths. With some effort, Naruto tore his eyes away from his classmate and picked his pace back up again. He was eager to get away from the Uchiha and the memory of those terrible eyes. When Naruto finally reached the grassy hill, surrounded by a copse of trees that he'd been looking for, he was disappointed to find that there was already someone there. He paused for a moment and was about to turn away when he suddenly stopped and squared his shoulders. No, he'd just spent the past week working his ass off and he wasn't going to let his day off be ruined. He wanted to sit on his hill and so he was going to, whether someone else was there or not. Naruto plopped down onto the grass and lay with his head resting back on his arms. He stared up into the sunny sky, studiously ignoring the boy next to him, even though he feel his gaze boring into the side of his head. For a long time neither of them said anything. Then, finally, the other boy looked away. "You're in my class," the boy noted quietly. Surprised, Naruto looked over at him. The boy next to him did indeed look to be around his age. He was rather average in appearance, dark hair, dark eyes, but there was some sort of sharpness in his gaze that instantly attracted Naruto's attention and curiosity. "But you hardly ever come to school," the other boy finished. Naruto shrugged. "I have more important things to do," he said simply. "And one doesn't have to learn about being a shinobi just by going to the academy." The dark-haired boy, med, thoughtfully. "Nara Shikamaru," he said, sitting up. With a grin, Naruto shifted into a sitting position as well. "Uzumaki Naruto. Nice to meet ya, Shika." Naruto spent the next few hours hanging out with Shikamaru, glad that the chance of fate had brought them together. He even taught the other boy how to play shogi, a game that Kenmaru had introduced him to some time ago, and he took to it like a fish to water. Naruto had little doubt that Shikamaru would soon far surpass him. Well, he did always enjoy a challenge. Eventually, however, Shikamaru had to head home and Naruto once again began to wander around the training grounds, eager to train after having been cooped up in an office for so long. Unfortunately, the first training ground that Naruto happened upon was already in use. The blonde released an annoyed sigh and turned to leave when a familiar name froze him in his tracks. "By Ibiki," a voice was saying. "Bullshit, someone else, female this time," argued. "You're good, but not that good. You're the one that caused us to fail the Chunin exam the first few times, remember? Yo. Too damn full of yourself sometimes, Katetsu, and making up fucking stories like some 5-year-old to impress us isn't going to help." Naruto heard the telltale sounds of someone stomping off and assumed that the woman had left. He crept forward and peeked around a tree to get a better look at what was going on. 2 men were standing there, Chunin most likely from their green vests. The first of them had spiky dark hair, a short goatee, and wore a white strip of cloth across his face, over the bridge of his nose. The second shinobi wore his headband in a bandana fashion, much like Ibiki. His brown hair was protruding from beneath it, completely covering his right eye. For several tense seconds the 2 men, both of whom looked to be in their early 20s, stared silently into the foliage, presumably after the woman. Then they glanced uneasily at each other. "She's getting testier every time we see her," the Chunin with the white cloth over his nose remarked. Naruto recognized his voice as the first person he'd heard and immediately labeled him, Katetsu, in his mind. The other man shrugged awkwardly. "So, Ibiki," he prompted. A brief smile flashed across Katetsu's face. It was gone just as quickly as it had appeared. "Yeah, like I said, he approached me the other day after I'd turned in my mission papers. He was curious about the Cloud Nin I'd run into and asked me a few questions. He seemed to be unusually interested in my side of the battle though. He'd said he'd contact me again, but I'm not entirely sure what about." He fell silent for a moment before glancing up at his companion again. "What do you think, Azumo?" Azumo hummed thoughtfully. "Who can guess at Morino-san's motives? He may be a Chunin like us, but it's well known throughout the village that he was apprenticed to the head of the Anbu torture and interrogation department. No one knows what he's doing now, Kotetsu mused. But it's assumed that he still works in intelligence. Interested to learn more about Ibiki's past, Naruto took an unconscious step forward. Unfortunately, in doing so he inadvertently stepped on a twig that cracked loudly beneath his weight. Instantly the two Chunin disappeared. Naruto quickly drew back while looking around wildly for them. He needn't have bothered however, for only moments later they appeared in front of him, looming over him. To the young boy's surprise, they did not look angry. If anything, they were amused by the child in front of them. "What's a kid like you doing out here?" Kotetsu asked warmly. He squatted down so that he was eye level with Naruto. "You've got to be quiet to be able to sneak up on us like you did," Izumo commented. "You training to be a shinobi?" Emboldened by their words, Naruto lifted his chin proudly. "Yeah, I'm in the academy. I'll be a shinobi in a few years." "Know any jutsu yet?" the shinobi in front of him asked with a grin. Naruto replied with a wide grin of his own. "Of course," he said. Then he suddenly frowned. "Though my chakra control is all out of whack, which can make things difficult." Kotetsu and Izumo exchanged glances. "I'm honestly surprised that you even understand the concept of chakra control," Kotetsu admitted. "Most kids your age don't." I read a lot." "Right," Kotetsu replied, raising one eyebrow. "As for the control problem, haven't your teachers taught you the leaf exercise?" Instantly Naruto scowled. "Yeah," he grumbled, "but I can't get it to fucking work, no matter what I do." "Can't?" Kotetsu trailed off, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Yeah, I keep pumping out too much chakra. I've tried limiting it as much as I can, but..." Once again Izumo and Kotetsu exchanged surprised looks. "Show us," Izumo prompted. Naruto shrugged in reply, seeing no harm in the question. He picked up a random leaf from off the ground, placed it on his forehead, and began to channel chakra. Instead of sticking to his forehead like it was supposed to, the leaf Abru Ptly shot away from him before slowly floating to the ground. Kotetsu's eyebrows shot up to his hairline. He let out a low whistle. "You weren't kidding about the chakra thing." "Maybe." Izumo began slowly and both Naruto and Kotetsu turned to watch him. "It'd be best if you practiced a control exercise that utilizes more chakra. That way you'd eventually be able to refine your control to do smaller exercises like the leaf one." Working backwards through the exercises, that could work, Kotetsu mused. Naruto rolled his eyes. "Yeah, it could, except I don't know any other exercises." He paused to eye the two men hopefully. Kotetsu easily got the hint and sniggered in amusement. "Yeah, we'll show you. We don't have much else to do right now, nay, Izumo." "Sure, and besides, you're an interesting kid." Torn between scowling at the comments and jumping up and down in joy, Naruto settled on simply nodding. And so the two Chunin drew Naruto aside and began to teach him how to climb trees without using his hands. A small boy with dark features flitted quietly through one of the red light district's back alleyways. His passage went unnoticed, partially because he seemed to easily flee from shadow to shadow and partially because everyone else in the area was too wrapped up in their own troubles to care. Eventually the boy crept inside a small, abandoned store. The floor was covered in dust and was littered with leaves and broken glass. The child carefully treaded around the obstacles, making no noise, and then brushed aside a thick velvet curtain hanging in the doorway so that he could move further inside. In the middle of the small complex was a room filled with dim light and some metal equipment. As the boy stepped inside, he found a skinny, green-haired man bandaging up a broad-shouldered man's bicep. The boy stood silently beside the door as the two men finished up, money passing hands. The second man strode out of the room then, but paused to glare at the dark-haired boy, who met him stare for stare. The man scoffed and then continued into the darkness. Meanwhile, the green-haired man was washing his ink-stained hands in a deep sink that was set into one wall. While drying his hands when he was finished, he stared at the boy with searching eyes. Then, abruptly, he began to chuckle. "An interesting guise, Naruto-kun." "Just practicing," Naruto said, grinning. "My chakra control needs some work. Plus it's always fun to be able to travel unnoticed." With a quick twist of his chakra, the boy released the henge he'd been wearing. The man shook his head in amusement, still chuckling. "Damn, shinobi, he muttered good-naturedly. Well, do you have the ink? With a sharp nod, Naruto pulled a scroll out of his pocket. He spread it out across the nearest table, bit his thumb just hard enough to draw blood, then with a quick flick of his wrist, dragged his thumb across the surface. The blood activated the sealed scroll and a glass bottle filled with ink popped into existence. The green-haired man picked the jar up and studied it thoughtfully. What's in it, specifically? He asked curiously. Ink laced with chakra and mixed with blood, Naruto replied. There were faint traces of satisfaction in his voice. Took me forever to get the mix just right, but this will be perfect for sealing. You'll be able to use it, right, Masaki? The man, Masaki, shook his head incredulously. Damn, kid, I don't know how you come up with harebrained ideas like this, he snorted. Tsuki's probably gonna crack up when he sees what you've done. But, yeah, so long as it's mostly ink. All able to use it no problem. Lay out the prints, take a seat, and we'll get started with the tattoos. Following Masaki's instructions, Naruto took out 2 identical scrolls and spread them out. These, however, weren't sealed scrolls. Instead they both had 3 large seal arrays made up of several smaller seals drawn on them. They were drawn backwards, actually, but only someone versed in seals would notice. They also were drawn with regular ink instead of chakra-laced ink so that even if chakra was channeled into them, they wouldn't activate. They were little more than pictures. Naruto then hopped up onto the seat in the middle of the room, rolling both his sleeves up as he did so. Masaki, who now had plastic gloves on, came over with a spray bottle full of rubbing alcohol to prep his skin. A minute later, once both of Naruto's arms were ready, Masaki picked up one of the scrolls that Naruto had laid out. The scrolls were actually mimeograph stencils, which were used to stencil the outline of the tattoo onto the skin. Masaki held the scroll up to Naruto's left arm. He held it there for a few seconds so that the carbon on the scroll would transfer onto the moistened skin. When he peeled it away, the stencil had transferred onto Naruto's arm correctly. Masaki repeated with process with the second scroll on the blonde's right arm. Masaki bustled around the room, opening up the needle and needle tube pouches that would be used. He assembled the machine next to Naruto and turned it on. Naruto felt the beginnings of nervousness start to well up within him as Masaki approached him with the needle, but he quickly pushed the feeling away. He wasn't doing this just to get a tattoo, but for his shinobi career. The first of the 3 seals was a sealing seal, which would be used to seal away weapons and equipment, so that he'd always have something on him. The following 2 were almost identical and were actually linked, even though they didn't look like it. These seals were Naruto's masterpiece. For years now, Naruto had been working on the problem that he had with chakra control. He knew now why he had such atrocious control. Because of the Kyuubi, he had massive amounts of chakra. And tons of chakra was very hard to control. He'd been working on his chakra control for a long time now, using various exercises he'd been taught by his shinobi Aku. Aintenses Katetsu and Izumo had been particularly helpful in that regard, but it just wasn't working fast enough. And so, Naruto had begun developing a seal that could help him to control his chakra. He'd gone through dozens and dozens of designs before an idea had suddenly sparked in his mind, inspired by sealing seals, as a matter of fact. The idea was thus: if he had less chakra, then he'd have better control. Basically, the seal stored his chakra. It would be constantly activated and would draw his chakra from the tenketsu on his arms and place it into storage. As all storage seals had limits, when the limit for the amount of chakra was reached, he had a failsafe in place that would allow the chakra to slowly bleed back into his body, recycling itself. All of this meant that Naruto's chakra would constantly be at a low level, granting him better control. As his conscious control grew better and better, he'd be able to lessen the amount of chakra that the seals drew in, further increasing his control. The bonus to the seals was that at all times he'd have a massive amount of chakra sealed away for emergency use. It would be almost impossible for him to get chakra exhaustion because, if needed, all he had to do was release all the chakra in one of the 4 seals back into his system. Naruto took a deep breath as Masaki's needle made first contact with his skin. Later that Su, Mmer found Naruto seated in a casino in the middle of Fire Country, energetically swinging his legs as he sat on a tall bar stool. Next to him was a busty blonde woman with a green diamond on her forehead. An acquaintance of Naruto's whom he'd run into many times while traveling around, which he was wont to do during the summer months. The woman was fully focused on the poker game before her, but Naruto, on the other hand, hadn't torn his eyes away from the notebook he was writing away on in hours. Abruptly, the woman slammed her cards down on the table, scowling fiercely at the men around the table who were laughing. She glared darkly at them before turning so that she was facing Naruto. She was about to snap something, but halted when she caught sight of what the boy was doing and instead began to chuckle. "Are you always working on seals, Yurei-kun?" she asked, amusement lacing her voice. Naruto started, not expecting the sudden interruption. "Sorry, Tsunade-san," he said sheepishly. "I kind of got drawn in." Tsunade laughed again and waved the response away flippantly. "You remind me of an old friend of mine," she replied, and Naruto took note of the melancholy glint in her eyes. "He was always messing around with seals too. What are you working on?" As the currently brown-haired boy glanced down at the notebook, a frown took over his face. "I'm working on a revised summoning seal," he explained. "The premise is that the seal, when placed on someone, will summon them to me like a summoning contract would. The difference is that the person is really there, so it's more like a transportation jutsu, to be honest. I keep running into problems though, such as how to get the summoned person to appear in the place they're supposed to." Tsunade's brow furrowed. "I'd have though, that the hardest part would be actually summoning someone," she commented. Not really," the boy shrugged. "That just takes a revised Shunshin body flicker technique seal. It's a bit complicated because of the long distances involved, but so long as that user has enough chakra, it's not much of a problem." "Oi, Yurei-kun," a voice suddenly beckoned. Naruto twisted around in his seat and saw a man standing in the small casino's doorway. "We're just ready to go." "All right, coming," he called back before turning back to the blonde he was sitting with. "Sorry, Tsunade-san, but it looks like the merchant train I'm with is leaving." Tsunade reached out and ruffled the young boy's hair while smiling softly. "No problem, Yurei-kun. I'll see you around." "Nay." Naruto gathered up his notebook and hopped off the stool. "Sure thing. See you later, old hag." Laughing, he dodged the bar stool that was suddenly chucked in his direction and took off at run. "Don't call me that, you brat." He child swiftly leapt out of the casino and jogged over to where a merchant wagon was standing as the last few inventory checks were done. Naruto preferred to travel alone, now that he was able to protect himself and walk for hours without tiring, but occasionally he joined up with a merchant that he knew. This time in particular he'd agreed to come along because Ryoga, the samurai he'd met on his first trip out of Konoha, had been among those hired to protect the merchant. Naruto traveled along with the merchant wagon for several days. It was in a town on the west side of Fire Country that he finally decided to split with them and, after waving goodbye to Ryoga and thanking the merchant, headed down a different road at a much quicker pace of travel. The end. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.